1903, fall asleep to hilarious history, The Winged Bicycle and the Panama Handshake by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson. Chapter 1. How to Build a Country in an Afternoon. The year of our Lord, 1903, arrived not with a whimper, but with the frantic, mechanical sputtering of a civilization that had suddenly realized it was late for an appointment with the future. If the 19th century was a long, slow drift down a muddy river on a flatboat, the 20th was shaping up to be a frantic gallop on a horse that had just been stung by a hornet and was now considering taking up aviation. At the center of this burgeoning chaos stood Theodore Roosevelt, a man who possessed the subtle, understated temperament of a steam shovel in a china shop. Teddy was a man of action, specifically other people's action, which he directed with the vigor of a conductor leading an orchestra made entirely of brass cannons. He had a problem, you see. He wanted a ditch. Not just any ditch, mind you, but a grand interoceanic waterway that would allow the American Navy to move from the Atlantic to the Pacific without having to circumnavigate South America, a continent which, while lovely, is inconveniently large and stubbornly unslotted. The French had tried to dig this ditch before in a place called Panama, which at the time was a disgruntled province of Colombia. The French effort had been a spectacular disaster involving equal parts financial embezzlement and yellow fever. They had spent $300 million to move a considerable amount of mud from one side of a hill to the other, only for the mud to slide back down the next morning out of sheer spite. By 1903, the French project was a graveyard of rusted machinery and broken dreams, presided over by a fellow named Hay-Bunau-Varilla, a man whose primary occupation was being intensely French and whose secondary hobby was trying to sell a bankrupt canal to anyone with a checkbook and a lack of common sense. Enter the United States. We offered Colombia $10 million and a modest annual rent for the rights to finish the job. It was a fair deal by the standards of international real estate, which is to say it was a legalized mugging with better stationery. But the Colombian Senate, in a rare and perhaps ill-advised display of national pride, looked at the offer, looked at the big stick Roosevelt was famously carrying and said, "No, thank you. We'd like more money, please." Now, in the delicate world of diplomacy, a no is usually the start of a long, boring conversation involving men in top hats drinking tea until everyone forgets why they were angry. But Theodore Roosevelt did not do boring. He did not do long. He heard the word no and reacted with the shocked indignation of a deity who had just been told his credit card was declined at a deli. "Those jackrabbits in Bogota," he presumably bellowed, though I wasn't there to record the exact species of mammal he compared them to. He decided that if Colombia wouldn't sell him a canal, he would simply find someone else who would. The problem was that Colombia owned the land. The solution, which is the sort of thing that only occurs to a great power or a particularly ambitious riverboat gambler, was to simply invent a new country that would say yes. The recipe for spontaneous sovereignty. Building a country from scratch usually takes centuries of shared hardship, a common language, and perhaps a few epic poems about sheep. In 1903, the United States proved you could do it in a long weekend if you had enough coal and a sympathetic telegraph operator. The Revolution was organized in a hotel room in New York City, which is, naturally, where all the best Central American uprisings are staged. Our friend Hay-Bunau-Varilla The Frenchman, who stood to lose millions if the canal wasn't built, met with a few Panamanian dissidents who were tired of being Colombian. They didn't have a plan, a treasury, or even a flag. Hay-Bunau-Varilla, ever the overachiever, sat down and designed a flag himself. It looked suspiciously like the American flag, but with different colors, which is the international diplomatic equivalent of wearing a fake mustache and hoping the landlord doesn't recognize you. He also provided them with a Declaration of Independence and a promise. If they revolted, the U.S. Navy would ensure it was the most peaceful, most successful, and most suspiciously convenient revolution in the history of the species. On November 3, 1903, the revolution began. I use quotation marks because calling it a revolution is like calling a polite disagreement over a dinner bill a barroom brawl. The Panamanian rebels, consisting largely of the local fire department and a few bored city employees, declared themselves a sovereign nation. The Colombian government, quite reasonably, sent troops to put down this sudden outbreak of independence. They arrived by sea, ready to march across the isthmus and remind the Panamanians that they were, in fact, still Colombian. However, upon arrival, they found the USS Nashville sitting in the harbor, its guns pointed with great clinical interest at the shoreline. The American commander informed the Colombians that, in the interest of maintaining neutral transit on the railroad, he couldn't possibly allow armed troops to travel across the country. It was a stroke of genius. It's hard to suppress a revolution when the only available transportation is a train line owned by the people cheering for the other side. The Colombian general was then offered a bribe, or rather, a generous retirement incentive, and he decided that being a general in a failed war was far less lucrative than being a wealthy civilian in a quiet one. He took the money and sailed away, presumably to buy a very nice house and a hat, with even more feathers on it. By the afternoon, Panama was a country. It had a flag, the one the Frenchman made. It had a government, the guys from the hotel, and it had the undivided attention of the United States Treasury. The paperwork of progress. The ink on Panama's birth certificate wasn't even dry before Hay-Bunau-Varilla, who had managed to get himself appointed the Panamanian minister to the U.S., despite being a French citizen who hadn't stepped foot in Panama in years, sat down with U.S. Secretary of State John Hay. Together, they wrote the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty. It gave the United States a 10-mile-wide strip of land in perpetuity, which is a fancy legal term for until the sun burns out and the lawyers stop billing. It gave the U.S. the right to act as if it were sovereign over that land. In exchange, the U.S. gave the new Republic of Panama $10 million. When the actual Panamanian delegates arrived in Washington, D.C. to negotiate their own treaty, they discovered that the Frenchman had already signed it for them 2 hours earlier. They were, to put it mildly, miffed. But when you are a country that is only 48 hours old, and your entire national defense consists of a U.S. battleship sitting in your front yard, you tend to sign the papers you're given and say thank you very loudly. Theodore Roosevelt later remarked, "I took the Canal Zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate goes on, the canal does also." It was a statement of such magnificent, unvarnished arrogance that it almost earns your respect. It was the moment the United States officially stopped asking for permission and started asking for the bill. A moral accounting or lack thereof. Thus, 1903 gave us a new nation, a new ditch to be, and a new precedent for international relations. We learned that the quickest way to solve a property dispute is to simply rename the property and hire a new landlord. To the rest of the world, it was a scandalous display of Yankee imperialism. To the Americans, it was progress. To the Colombians, it was a very expensive lesson in the importance of saying yes the first time. And to the Panamanians, it was the start of a very complicated relationship with their giant neighbor to the north, the kind of neighbor who helps you move into your new house, but then decides he owns the hallway and the bathroom and would like to install a toll booth in your kitchen. As the sun set on the first chapter of 1903, the world was a little smaller, the U.S. was a little larger, and the map makers of the world were frantically scrubbing out the word Colombia and replacing it with Panama in pencil, just in case Roosevelt decided to invent another country before breakfast the next day. It was a grand, hilarious, and utterly brazen start to the year, and while the diplomats argued over the ethics of it all, the engineers were already packing their bags, sharpening their shovels, and trying to remember if they'd had their yellow fever vaccinations. The dirt was about to fly, and gravity was about to be served its first notice of eviction. Chapter 2. The Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, a master class in selling what isn't yours. If diplomacy is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they actually look forward to the trip, then the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was the art of selling someone else's house while they were still in the backyard trying to figure out why the locks had been changed. It remains one of the most breathtaking pieces of sleight of hand in the history of international relations, a feat of bureaucratic wizardry that would make a Mississippi shell game operator weep with professional envy. At the heart of this farce was Hay-Bunau-Varilla. To understand Philippe, you must imagine a man who was approximately 90% mustache and 10% frantic Gallic ambition. He was a shareholder in the defunct French Canal Company, and he had a very simple, very expensive problem. If the Americans didn't buy the rights to the Panama Canal from the French, his stock certificates would be worth slightly less than the paper they were printed on, which at the time was being used primarily for lighting cigars. Felipe was a man who believed that if life gave you lemons, you shouldn't just make lemonade, you should sell the lemonade back to the lemon tree at a 300% markup. The representative of nowhere. By the second week of November, 1903, Panama was technically a country, mostly because the United States Navy said so, and it's very hard to argue with a battleship when your national army consists of 3 guys and a very determined goat. The new Panamanian government, still dusting the Colombian soot off their trousers, appointed Hay-Bunau-Varilla as their minister plenipotentiary to Washington. Now, usually, a minister plenipotentiary is a citizen of the country he represents. Philippe was French. He hadn't been to Panama in years. He didn't particularly care about Panama's long-term health, its culture, or its climate, unless that climate involved a favorable exchange rate. But he was in Washington, and the actual Panamanians, the ones who lived there and might have had opinions on things like sovereignty and not being sold out, were currently on a very slow boat and an even slower train headed toward the capital. It was a race. On one side, the Panamanian delegation, led by Manuel Amador Guerrero, chugging northward with a list of reasonable demands. On the other side, Hay-Bunau-Varilla, armed with a pen, a sense of impending financial ruin, and the realization that if he didn't sign a treaty before the Panamanians arrived, they might actually insist on reading it first. The Midnight Inkwell. On the evening of November 18, 1903, Philippa went to the home of U.S. Secretary of State John Hay. Hay was a refined man, a former secretary to Abraham Lincoln, and a man who appreciated the finer points of a well-executed maneuver. He had prepared a treaty that was already quite favorable to the United States. But Philippe, in a fit of more loyal than the king desperation, had rewritten it to be even more generous. He wanted to make the offer so ridiculously lopsided that the U.S. Senate couldn't possibly reject it. He was like a man trying to sell a used car who, upon seeing the buyer hesitate, offers to throw in his firstborn son, his neighbor's lawnmower, and the secret to eternal life, just to seal the deal before the police arrive. "Here," Philippe essentially said, thrusting the papers at Hay. "Take the land, take the sovereignty, take the right to intervene whenever you feel a bit bored or notice a breeze. We'll take the $10 million and you can keep the change." The treaty gave the United States a 10-mile-wide canal zone, but it didn't just give it to them for a few years, it gave it to them in perpetuity. That is a terrifying phrase in legal circles. It means forever and then a day, and if the universe ends, we still get the mineral rights to the void. The United States was granted all the rights, power, and authority which the United States would possess and exercise if it were the sovereign of the territory. In short, we weren't just renting a room. We were becoming the landlord, the police force, and the guy who decides what color the curtains are, forever. Hay-Bunau-Varilla signed the document at 6:40 p.m. in Hay's library. They used a historic inkstand. They probably used a very fancy blotter. They certainly used a great deal of audacity. The arrival of the owners. 2 hours later, exactly 2 hours, the train carrying the actual Panamanian delegation pulled into the station in Washington. Manuel Amador Guerrero and his companions stepped onto the platform, likely adjusting their ties and rehearsing their opening gambits for the upcoming negotiations. They were greeted by Hay-Bunau-Varilla, who was wearing the triumphant grin of a cat that had not only swallowed the canary, but had also sold the bird's nest for a tidy profit. "I have settled the matter," Philippe announced, waving the signed treaty like a holy relic. Amador was flummoxed. "What matter? We just got here. We haven't even had dinner." "The treaty!" Philippa cried. "It is signed. It is sealed. We are a nation. Also, I gave away the center of our country in perpetuity, but look at this lovely gold pen I used." The Panamanians were, to put it mildly, incandescent with rage. They realized they had been Bunau-Varilla'd. They had come to negotiate a partnership. They found they had been served as the main course at a private dinner party. Amador reportedly nearly fainted from the shock. There were rumors of a physical altercation, or at least a very spirited attempt to turn Philippa's mustache into a decorative wall hanging. But Philippe was unmoved. He pointed out the cold, hard reality of 1903. If they didn't ratify this treaty, the United States might decide that Panama wasn't a country after all. They might withdraw the Navy. The Colombians were still just over the border, and they were significantly less miffed and significantly more bloodthirsty than the Americans. It was a classic take-it-or-leave-it offer, where leave it involved a high probability of being executed by a Colombian firing squad. The Panamanian government, with a collective sigh that could be heard from the Caribbean to the Pacific, ratified the treaty. The real estate logic of the century. The Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty remains a masterpiece of the Big Stick era. It was a deal made between a man who didn't own the land and a man who didn't want to pay full price for it, at the expense of a people who were too small to say no. It was, as I mentioned, a masterclass in real estate. If you tried this today, if you went to your neighbor's house while he was at work, signed a deed over to the local highway department in exchange for a new set of golf clubs, and then told your neighbor he was lucky you didn't let them bulldoze his garage too, you would be arrested. In 1903, however, you got a statue and a footnote in history. Theodore Roosevelt was delighted. He had his ditch. The French shareholders were delighted. They had their money. Philippe was delighted. He had his ego. And the Panamanians? Well, they had their independence, even if it came with a 10-mile-wide American asterisk running right through the middle of it. The treaty set the stage for a decade of mud, steam shovels, and the kind of engineering that makes the pyramids look like a weekend DIY project. But more importantly, it established the tone for the new century, a century where things happened fast, where the paperwork followed the gunboats, and where a Frenchman with a mustache could redraw the map of the world before the people living on it had even finished their breakfast. With the Panama handshake complete, the United States turned its gaze northward. We had a canal, but we also had a border dispute with Canada over Alaska. It turns out that when you start drawing lines on maps, it's very hard to stop, especially when there's gold under the ink. Chapter 3. The Alaska Boundary Dispute, where gold is thicker than blood. Having successfully invented a country in the tropics, the United States decided it was time to turn its attention to the frozen north. If the Panama affair was a high-stakes game of three-card Monte played in a humid basement, the Alaska boundary dispute was a refined game of poker, played in a walk-in freezer, where one player has a derringer up his sleeve and the other is playing with his own rent money. The problem, as is usually the case when maps are involved, began with the Russians. Back in 1825, the Russians and the British signed a treaty to decide where Russian America, Alaska, ended and British North America, Canada, began. Since the area in question was primarily populated by grizzly bears and glaciers, neither of which are particularly concerned with international law, the treaty was written with the vague poeticism of a man describing a dream he had while drunk on vodka. The border was supposed to follow the crest of the mountains parallel to the coast, but no further than 10 marine leagues from the sea. This sounds lovely in a drawing room in St. Petersburg, but on the ground, the Alaskan coastline is a jagged mess of fjords, inlets, and bays that looks like it was designed by a cartographer having a nervous breakdown. For decades, nobody cared. Alaska was viewed as a giant, useless icebox, and the Panhandle, that strip of land running down the coast, was just a place where trees grew sideways. Then, in the late 1890s, someone found a shiny yellow rock in the Klondike. The Klondike fever and the Lynn Canal. Suddenly, the useless icebox was a treasure chest. Thousands of prospectors rushed north, all of them eager to trade their life savings for a shovel, a bag of flour, and a high probability of dying of scurvy. The Canadians realized that if they could claim the heads of the deep water inlets, specifically the Lynn Canal, they would have a direct sea route to their gold fields. The Americans, who had purchased Alaska in 1867, a transaction known at the time as Seward's Folly, mostly because people hadn't realized you could find gold in a freezer, insisted that the 10-league rule meant the border followed every twist and turn of the coastline, effectively cutting Canada off from the Pacific. To the Americans, the Panhandle was a solid wall. To the Canadians, it was a broken wall that should let them through to the water. It was a classic property dispute. In a civilized world, you might call a surveyor. In 1903, you called Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy's impartial tribunal. By 1903, the tension had reached a boiling point. The Canadians were indignant, the Americans were stubborn, and the British, who still handled Canada's foreign affairs, were caught in the middle like a parent trying to mediate a fight between a disgruntled teenager and a neighbor who keeps a pet tiger on a very thin leash. Roosevelt, true to form, was not in a mood for compromise. He viewed the Canadian claim as dangerously close to blackmail, which is a fascinating observation coming from the man who had just liberated Panama. He made it clear that if the dispute wasn't settled to his satisfaction, he would simply send the army to draw the line where he wanted it. Eventually, all parties agreed to a tribunal. It was to consist of 6 impartial jurists of repute. Now, impartial is a word that politicians use when they mean biased in a way that favors me. Roosevelt's idea of impartiality was to appoint 3 Americans who had already publicly stated that the Canadian claim was nonsense. The Canadians appointed 2 jurists who were naturally convinced the American claim was a land grab. This left the tie-breaking vote to the 6th man, Lord Alverston, the Lord Chief Justice of England. Poor Lord Alverston. He was a man tasked with a choice. He could side with Canada and uphold the honor of the British Empire's most loyal dominion, or he could side with the United States and avoid a war with a country that was rapidly becoming the most powerful and most irritable nation on earth. The Great Betrayal. The tribunal met in London. There was a great deal of looking at old maps, squinting at mountain ranges, and debating the definition of the word coast. The Canadians argued that the coast should be measured from the outer islands. The Americans argued it should be measured from the heads of the deepest saltwater inlets. As the proceedings dragged on, Roosevelt's big stick made a quiet appearance. He let it be known to the British government that if the decision went against the U.S., he would stop talking and start shooting. Britain, at the time, was feeling a bit lonely. They had just finished the Boer War. They were worried about the rising power of Germany, and the last thing they wanted was to pick a fight with Teddy Roosevelt over a few miles of frozen mud and some disgruntled prospectors. In the end, Lord Alverstone did what any sensible man does when caught between a screaming relative and a man with a shotgun. He sided with the man with the shotgun. By a vote of 4-2, the tribunal ruled in favor of the United States. The Americans kept the Lynn Canal. Canada was officially locked out of the sea. The birth of a grudge. The reaction in Canada was one of pure, unadulterated fury. They weren't just mad at the Americans. They were livid with the British. They felt they had been sold down the river, or rather, sold off the coast, to satisfy the diplomatic needs of London. The Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, lamented that Canada didn't have the power to make its own treaties. This betrayal in 1903 is often cited as the moment Canada decided it was time to grow up, move out of the British basement, and start making its own mistakes. It was the spark of modern Canadian nationalism, fueled by the realization that in the game of international politics, blood is thicker than water, but gold and American battleships are thicker than both. Roosevelt, meanwhile, was delighted. He had secured the borders of the North just as he had secured the ditch in the South. He had proven that impartiality is a wonderful thing, provided you are the one who gets to define it. As the dust and snow settled on the Alaska dispute, 1903 showed no signs of slowing down. We had rearranged the map of the Western Hemisphere twice in 6 months. It was time for humanity to stop fighting over the ground and start looking at the sky. For while the politicians were arguing over where the land ended, two bicycle mechanics in Ohio were quietly figuring out a way to bypass land altogether. If gravity wouldn't give us a break, we would simply have to break gravity. Chapter 4. The Wright Brothers' 12-Second Miracle, or How Two Bicycle Mechanics Ruined the Silence of the Skies. For several thousand years, humanity's relationship with the sky was one of profound, unrequited longing. We watched the birds with a mixture of envy and suspicion, wondering why a creature with a brain the size of a dried pea was allowed to navigate the heavens, while the pinnacle of creation was forced to trudge through the mud, occasionally tripping over a stray cow. We tried everything to join them. We strapped feathers to our arms and leaped off towers. We filled giant silk bags with hot air and floated wherever the breeze felt like taking us, usually into the side of a mountain or a very surprised oak tree. But controlled, powered flight, the ability to go exactly where you wanted to go without the intervention of a gale or a miracle, remained the exclusive province of eagles, bumblebees, and particularly athletic mosquitoes. In 1903, the scientific community believed that if man were meant to fly, he would have been born with much lighter bones and a significantly better aerodynamic profile. The experts, funded by government grants and draped in the dignity of prestigious universities, were busy building massive, expensive contraptions that had the flight characteristics of a cast-iron stove. Meanwhile, in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers named Wilbur and Orville Wright were approaching the problem from a different angle, the angle of the bicycle. The gospel of the chain and sprocket. The Wright brothers were not scientists in the traditional sense, which is to say, they didn't have a lot of letters after their names or a tendency to use 5-syllable words when a grunt would suffice. They ran a bicycle shop. This is a crucial detail. A bicycle is a masterpiece of unstable equilibrium. It is a machine that wants to fall over and is only kept upright by the constant subtle corrections of the rider. Wilbur and Orville realized that an airplane shouldn't be a stable platform, like a boat on water, but an unstable one, like a bicycle in the air. The secret wasn't just lift. Any fool could create lift if he had enough engine and a flat enough board. The secret was control. While the great men of science were trying to build aerodromes that would fly themselves, the Wrights were in their back room, building a wind tunnel out of a starch box and a fan, figuring out how to warp wings like a hawk's and how to build a rudder that actually did something other than look decorative. They treated the air not as a mystery, but as a particularly fickle gear assembly. the ominous sands of Kitty Hawk. To test their theories, they needed two things: steady wind and a lot of soft sand to fall into. They chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a place that at the time consisted entirely of wind, sand, and mosquitoes that were large enough to require their own tail numbers. The local residents, mostly fishermen and Coast Guard crews, watched these two lean, somber men in high collars and neckties dragging giant kites across the dunes and concluded that they were either geniuses or, more likely, had been out in the sun far too long without a hat. By December 1903, the Wrights had their flyer ready. It was a spindly affair of spruce, ash, and muslin, held together by enough piano wire to equip a concert hall. It looked less like a conqueror of the skies and more like a very ambitious clothes-drying rack that had developed a motor. The motor itself was a minor miracle, a 12-horsepower block of aluminum they'd had to build themselves because no car manufacturer in America could produce an engine light enough and powerful enough to meet their needs. It had the power of a modern lawnmower, but in 1903, it was the roaring heart of a new era. December 17th, 12 seconds, that changed the menu. The morning of December 17th was cold, windy, and miserable. Perfect weather for making history, provided you don't mind losing a few toes to frostbite. There were 5 witnesses: 3 members of the Kill Devil Hills life-saving station, a local businessman, and a lumberyard employee. It was not exactly the World's Fair crowd. There were no brass bands, no fluttering pennants, and no politicians trying to take credit. There was just the sound of the wind and the rhythmic chug, chug, chug of an engine that was about to pick a fight with gravity. Orville took the first turn, lying flat on his stomach on the lower wing. Wilbur stood to the side, holding the wingtip to keep the machine level on its wooden launching rail. At 10:35 a.m., the flyer started to move. It didn't soar into the air with the grace of a swan. It lurched, it wobbled, it rose 10 feet, dipped, rose again, and fought the air as if it were trying to climb an invisible, grease-covered ladder. The flight lasted exactly 12 seconds. It covered 120 feet. To put that in perspective, the distance covered by the first flight in human history is less than the wingspan of a modern Boeing 747. If Orville had been flying inside a 747, he wouldn't have even made it from the coach section to the first-class lavatory. But those 120 feet were the most important 120 feet ever traveled. For the first time, a human being had taken off under his own power, flown through the air without losing speed, and landed without becoming a permanent part of the landscape. They did it 3 more times that day. The final flight, with Wilbur at the controls, lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. Then, a sudden gust of wind caught the flyer while it was on the ground, flipped it over, and smashed it into a pile of kindling. The machine never flew again. But it didn't matter. The point had been made. Gravity had been served its walking papers. The silence of the world. You might think that the next day's newspapers were filled with headlines like "Man Conquers the Heavens" or "Gravity Retires in Disgrace." In reality, the world didn't give a hoot. The Wrights sent a telegram to their father. "Success 4 flights Thursday morning. Inform press." The press, however, was busy. A few local papers carried a garbled account of the event, but most editors looked at the story and thought, 12 seconds? My Uncle Silas can stay in the air longer than that if he trips over a porch swing. Call me when they fly to New York. Even the Dayton Daily News, their hometown paper, didn't mention it the next day. They were much more interested in the local Christmas sales and a particularly scandalous divorce case. It was a classic human reaction. We spend 10,000 years dreaming of a miracle, and when it finally happens, we're too distracted by the price of eggs to notice. The Wrights, being the stoic, practical Ohioans they were, didn't complain. They went back to Dayton, put their suits back on, and started working on a better version. They knew what they had done. They had opened a door that could never be shut again. The legacy of the miracle. Looking back from the vantage point of the future, 1903 was the year we traded our peace and quiet for speed. Before the Wrights, the sky was a cathedral of silence disturbed only by the occasional thunderclap or the cry of a hawk. After the Wrights, the sky became a highway, a battlefield, and eventually a place where you sit in a pressurized tube eating tiny bags of pretzels while wondering why the man in 14B is snoring so loudly. Wilbur and Orville didn't intend to create the modern airport experience with its TSA lines and overpriced bottled water. They just wanted to solve a mechanical problem. They wanted to see if a bicycle could be made to ride on the wind. But in doing so, they ensured that humanity would never have a peaceful Sunday afternoon ever again. They made the world smaller, louder, and infinitely more complicated. They proved that with enough stubbornness, a bit of spruce, and a decent chain drive, you can tell the laws of physics to move aside and make room for a couple of guys from Ohio. As 1903 drew to a close, the Wrights were back in their shop, probably truing a wheel for a local schoolboy. But up on the dunes of Kitty Hawk, the wind was blowing over a set of tracks in the sand, tracks that didn't lead back to the road, but pointed straight up into the blue. And while the Wrights were celebrating their 12 seconds of glory, another man, a man with a lot more money and a much fancier houseboat, was staring at the bottom of the Potomac River, wondering where it all went wrong. Chapter 5. The Failure of the Great Aerodrome, or How to Turn $50,000 into a Very Expensive Splash. While the Wright brothers were quietly tinkering in the back of an Ohio bicycle shop, armed with nothing but a wind tunnel made of starch boxes and a refusal to acknowledge the impossible, the United States government was busy putting its money on the sure thing. And in 1903, the sure thing was a man named Samuel Pierpont Langley. If you were looking for a man to invent flight in 1903, Langley was the fellow you'd find in central casting. He was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, a man of such immense scientific pedigree that his shadow probably had a Ph.D. He was an astronomer, a physicist, and a man who could discuss the thermal properties of the sun without breaking a sweat. In the eyes of the War Department, Langley was a scientist, whereas the Wrights were merely mechanics. In the early 20th century, that distinction was the difference between a government grant and a polite "no, thank you." The War Department, sensing that the future of warfare involved dropping things on people from a great height, gave Langley $50,000, a sum that, in 1903, could have purchased a small Midwestern city or at least enough bicycles to reach the moon. Langley's mission was simple: build a machine that could fly. He called it the Great Aerodrome because When you have $50,000 of the taxpayers' money, you don't call your invention a flyer or a plane. You give it a name that sounds like a Greek tragedy or a very expensive brand of cologne. The design of a dragonfly's nightmare. The aerodrome was a magnificent, terrifying sight. It featured a tandem wing design, two sets of wings, one in front of the other, that made it look like a dragonfly that had been designed by a committee of people who had only ever seen a dragonfly from a very great distance. It was powered by a 52-horsepower radial engine, which was, quite frankly, a masterpiece of engineering. It had more power in its little toe than the Wright's entire machine. But there was a fundamental flaw in Langley's approach. He believed that the secret to flight was power and prestige. He thought that if you threw enough horsepower and enough scientific theory at the air would eventually give up and let you through. He overlooked the one thing the bicycle mechanics understood in their bones: control. Langley's aerodrome had no real way for a pilot to steer it. It was designed to be inherently stable, which is a lovely idea for a bridge, but a terrible idea for a flying machine. A plane that is perfectly stable is a plane that refuses to change its mind when it's headed for a tree. The houseboat and the catapult. Langley, being a man of dignity, decided that the best way to launch his masterpiece was not from a dusty field or a sandy dune, but from the top of a massive houseboat anchored in the Potomac River. The logic was sound in a bureaucratic sort of way. If the machine failed over water, the pilot, a brave soul named Charles Manley, would merely get a refreshing dip. If it failed over land, he would become a permanent feature of the geography. Furthermore, the houseboat could be turned to face the wind, and it provided a level of privacy from the prying eyes of the press. Though, as it turned out, the press was more than happy to watch from the shore with binoculars and a very sharpened sense of schadenfreude. The launch mechanism was a massive, spring-loaded catapult. The plan was to fling the aerodrome into the air at such a speed that it had no choice but to fly. It was, essentially, a giant slingshot designed to hurl a man and a delicate muslin and steel dragonfly into the unknown. October 7th, 1903. The first plunge. On October 7th, 1903, the world, or at least the part of it that lived near Washington, D.C., held its breath. The aerodrome was perched on its rail, the engine was roaring, Charles Manley was at the controls, looking like a man who had suddenly realized his life insurance policy had an experimental aviation exclusion clause. The catapult was released. There was a mighty whoosh, a cloud of steam, and then nothing. The aerodrome didn't soar. It didn't glide. According to one witness, it slid off the rail like a handful of mortar and plunged directly into the Potomac. It had snagged on the launching mechanism, and instead of taking to the skies, it had performed a graceful $50,000 somersault into the mud. Manley was fished out of the water, wet and shivering, but alive. The aerodrome was dragged back onto the houseboat, looking like a very damp, very expensive, drowned bird. Langley blamed the catapult. The press, however, began to sharpen their pens. December 8th, 1903. The sequel no one wanted. Langley was undeterred. He spent 2 months repairing the machine and tweaking the catapult. He was determined to prove that the Smithsonian could do what no one else had. On December 8th, just 9 days before the Wright brothers would make history in North Carolina, Langley tried again. The scene was the same: the houseboat, the river, the roaring engine, and the increasingly nervous Charles Manley. This time, the failure was even more spectacular. As the machine left the rail, the rear wing collapsed. The aerodrome did a spectacular backflip, pointing its nose straight at the sky for one glorious, ironic second, before crashing tail first into the icy waters of the Potomac. Manley nearly drowned this time, getting pinned under the wreckage in the freezing river. When they finally pulled him out, he was reportedly heard to utter a string of words that were not, strictly speaking, scientific in nature. The great aerodrome was a total loss, and so, it seemed, was Langley's reputation. The verdict of the vultures. The reaction from the press was merciless. The New York Times suggested that perhaps humanity should stop trying to fly and leave it to the birds. They estimated that it might take another 1,000,000 years of mathematical research before a man could fly. Congress was even less charitable. One representative remarked that the only thing Langley had proven was that even a mathematician can't make a rock fly. The War Department pulled the plug on the funding, declaring that we are still far from the day when engines of war will fly through the air. It was a crushing blow for Langley. He was a brilliant man who had fallen victim to the greatest trap of the establishment: the belief that money and theory are a substitute for grease and trial and error. He had tried to conquer the air with a catapult and a committee, while the Wrights were conquering it with a bicycle chain and a sense of balance. The moral of the muddy river. The failure of the great aerodrome is one of history's great cautionary tales. It reminds us that prestige is no protection against the law of gravity. You can have the backing of the president, the keys to the Smithsonian, and the finest radial engine in the world, but if your wings snag on the catapult of your own hubris, you're still going to get wet. Langley died a few years later, his heart broken by the ridicule and the realization that two uneducated mechanics from Ohio had done for a few $100s what he couldn't do with 50,000. But history is a funny thing. Years later, the Smithsonian would display Langley's aerodrome and claim it was the first machine capable of flight, leading to a long and bitter feud with the Wright brothers. It turns out that even when you lose, if you own the museum, you can still try to rewrite the scoreboard. But in 1903, the score was clear. The great aerodrome was at the bottom of a river, and the flyer was about to take to the sky. Prestige had lost, bicycle chains had won, and the world was about to find out that once you get a man into the air, the hardest part isn't getting him up there. It's convincing him to come back down and pay his taxes. Chapter 6. The First Tour de France, or 60 Men in Search of a Reason. If the 20th century has taught us anything thus far, it is that humanity possesses an inexhaustible, almost pathological desire to see how much suffering the human body can endure before it simply decides to resign and vacate the premises. In America, we were busy trying to fling ourselves off sand dunes and houseboats. In France, they decided the pinnacle of human achievement would be to sit on a narrow strip of leather and pedal a heavy iron frame across the entire country until their legs turned into overcooked noodles, and their dignity was a distant memory. The Tour de France was born in 1903, not out of a noble desire for athletic excellence, but out of the most sacred of all modern motivations, a newspaper circulation war. Henri Desgrange, the editor of a sports paper called L'Auto, found himself in a bit of a pickle. His rival paper, Le Vélo, was winning the hearts and sous of the French public. Desgrange needed a stunt. He needed a spectacle so grand, so grueling, and so fundamentally absurd that people would have no choice but to buy his paper just to see if the participants were still alive. His young cycling reporter, Géo Lefebvre, suggested a 6-stage race around France. Desgrange, a man who likely viewed moderation as a personal insult, agreed. The plan was simple. 60 men would ride 2,428 kilometers, about 1,500 miles, in 6 massive stages. To put this in perspective, these stages were often over 400 kilometers long. This meant the riders would be on their bicycles for 18 to 20 hours at a time, pedaling through the night on roads that were less thoroughfares and more random collections of sharp rocks and aggressive mud. The machines and the madmen. The thoroughbred racing bicycle of 1903 was a far cry from the carbon fiber whispers of the future. It was a fixed-gear beast made of heavy steel, weighing roughly 35 pounds, about the same as a medium-sized sledgehammer. It had no brakes to speak of, no gears to assist with the Alps, and tires that had the structural integrity of a wet cigar. The riders themselves were a motley crew of adventurers, coal miners, and people who had clearly lost a very high-stakes bet. They wore thick wool jerseys that became heavy as lead when it rained and acted as portable saunas when the sun came out. They didn't have helmets. They had flat caps, which were excellent for keeping the sun out of one's eyes but offered approximately zero protection when one's head made sudden, violent contact with a French milestone. Then there was the matter of training. In 1903, sports science was in its infancy, which is to say, it hadn't been born yet. The prevailing wisdom was that water was a dangerous substance that would clog the lungs. Instead, the riders fueled themselves with red wine for courage, beer for hydration, champagne for the final sprint and to forget the previous 20 hours, cigarettes to open the lungs before a steep climb. It is a miracle any of them made it out of the starting gate, let alone across the finish line. The course, a tour of torture. The race began on July 1, 1903, outside the Café Au Réveil Matin in a suburb of Paris. 60 riders set off into the unknown. The first stage alone was 467 kilometers, ending in Lyon. For those of you who don't speak endurance, that is the equivalent of riding a bicycle from New York City to Richmond, Virginia, in one go, on a bike that weighs as much as a small dog, while drinking wine and dodging stray sheep. Because the stages were so long, much of the riding happened at night. There were no streetlights, no GPS, and no support vans. If a rider's tire popped, which happened with the frequency of a drum solo, he had to fix it himself. If his frame snapped, he had to find a blacksmith. If he got lost and ended up in a different country, he simply had to pedal back and hope no one noticed. The riders were forbidden from receiving help. One fellow, Maurice Garin, the favorite to win, was a former chimney sweep. He was small, wiry, and possessed a temperament that suggested he had replaced his nervous system with pure unadulterated spite. He rode with a white jacket and a stoicism that would have made a gargoyle look flighty. the art of the creative shortcut. While we like to think of the pioneers of sport as paragons of virtue, the 1903 tour was a master class in the art of cheating. Since the riders were often alone in the dark on deserted country roads, the temptation to improve one's circumstances was overwhelming. Rumors abounded of riders accepting tows from cars, a popular choice for those who found hills a bit too uphill. Taking the train, a classic maneuver. You simply hop on a local freight at midnight and hop off 20 miles down the road looking suitably exhausted. Hiring thugs. Fans of certain riders would occasionally hide in the bushes and throw tacks on the road, or in some cases, physically assault the rivals of their favorite cyclist. The 1903 race was relatively clean compared to the 1904 version, which was so rife with cheating it nearly ended the tradition entirely. But even in the inaugural year, the spirit of winning at all costs, especially if it involves a locomotive, was alive and well. The triumph of the chimney sweep. After 19 days and 6 grueling stages, the survivors limped back into Paris. Of the 60 who started, only 21 finished. Maurice Garin won the race, finishing nearly 3 hours ahead of the second-place rider. He had spent a total of 94 hours and 33 minutes in the saddle. The French public went wild. They had found a new set of heroes, the giants of the road. Desgrange was delighted. His newspaper sales had quadrupled. He had proven that if you give people enough suffering to read about, they will happily pay a few centimes for the privilege. The Tour de France became a national institution almost overnight. It celebrated the French landscape, but more importantly, it celebrated the French capacity for douleur, pain. It turned the bicycle from a toy for the wealthy into a symbol of national grit. A verdict on the velocipede. As the riders of 1903 soaked their blistered feet and vowed never to look at a bicycle again, a vow most of them broke the following year, the world looked on in bemusement. We had entered an era where speed was everything. If you weren't flying through the air like the Wrights, you were hurtling across the countryside on 2 wheels like a madman. The Tour de France reminded us that even in an age of steam and steel, the most impressive machine is still the human heart, provided you keep it well lubricated with a steady supply of Bordeaux and a stubborn refusal to admit that walking would be much easier. 1903 was proving to be a year of incredible motion. We had moved the borders of Alaska, we had moved the dirt in Panama, and we had moved 60 men across France. Now it was time to move the masses. A fellow in Detroit was about to take all this talk of motors and wheels and turn it into something every American could afford, and something every horse would learn to hate. Chapter 7. Henry Ford's Third Time's the Charm, or How to Insult a Horse and Get Rich Doing It. By 1903, the horse, that noble four-legged servant of humanity, was beginning to suspect that the wind was blowing in a decidedly mechanical direction. For thousands of years, if you wanted to go somewhere faster than a brisk walk, you had to negotiate with a creature that possessed the intellect of a turnip and the temperament of a disgruntled landlord. Horses were expensive, they required constant refueling with hay, and they possessed the unfortunate habit of depositing exhaust in the middle of the street that required a small army of men with shovels to manage. Enter the horseless carriage. In the early years of the century, These contraptions were viewed by the general public as loud, greasy, and prone to spontaneous combustion. Essentially, a way for wealthy young men to commit suicide at 20 miles per hour while terrifying every cow in a 3-mile radius. At the center of this burgeoning mechanical madness was Henry Ford. Now, in the popular mythology of the future, Henry Ford is often depicted as a man who emerged from the womb holding a wrench and a blueprint for a production line. In reality, by the start of 1903, Henry Ford was primarily known in Detroit as a man who was exceptionally good at failing. The art of the spectacular flop. Henry had already tried twice. His first venture, the Detroit Automobile Company, failed because Henry was a perfectionist who spent all his time tinkering with one car while his investors were screaming for a product they could actually sell. It turns out that investors are funny that way. They generally prefer a profit over a theoretical masterpiece that is still missing its left rear wheel. His second attempt, the Henry Ford Company, ended even more spectacularly. Henry got into a spat with his backers, walked out, and left them with the factory. Those backers eventually hired a fellow named Leland to take over, who renamed the company Cadillac. If you've ever wondered why Henry Ford spent the rest of his life with a chip on his shoulder the size of a transmission block, that might be your answer. By June of 1903, Henry was 40 years old, which in those days was considered the twilight of one's youth. And he was essentially a two-time loser in the eyes of the Detroit banking community. He was the man who kept promising a revolution and delivering a headache. But Henry had a dream, and more importantly, he had a coal dealer named Alexander Malcolmson who was willing to gamble one more time. $28,000 and a box of angry parts. On June 16, 1903, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated. It was a modest affair. They didn't have a massive factory or 1,000 workers. They had a converted wagon shop on Mack Avenue and 12 investors who had scraped together exactly $28,000 in cash. To put that in perspective, $28,000 was enough to buy a very nice house or a very large quantity of high-quality cigars. But it was an absurdly small amount of money with which to start a global industrial empire. Among the investors were two brothers named John and Horace Dodge. The Dodge brothers were rough-and-tumble machinists who ran a shop that built the engines and transmissions for the first Fords. They were the kind of men who would drink a pint of whiskey for breakfast and then build a precision-engineered crankshaft before lunch. They were essential to the operation, primarily because Henry still had a habit of wanting to change the design every 15 minutes, and the Dodges were the only ones who could tell him no without getting fired. The first product was the Model A. Now, don't confuse this with the Model A of 1927, which actually looked like a car. The 1903 Model A looked like a Victorian parlor chair that had been bolted to a buckboard and fitted with a 2-cylinder engine that produced a whopping 8 horsepower. It was steered by a tiller, a long metal handle, because the steering wheel was still considered a radical innovation that might confuse the simple-minded driver. The great panic of the pedestrian. The Model A was sold for $850. If you wanted the optional rubber fabric top, it cost another $30. If you wanted the tonneau, the back seat, that was an extra $100. It was marketed as the most reliable machine on earth, which was a bold claim for a device that frequently required the driver to get out and push it up any hill steeper than a stack of pancakes. Driving a car in 1903 was not an act of transportation, it was an act of adventure. There were no gas stations. You bought your fuel in gallon cans at the local pharmacy or hardware store. There were no paved roads outside of the major cities. Once you left the city limits, you were navigating a sea of mud and ruts that could swallow a wheel whole. Then there were the horses. Horses, quite reasonably, viewed the motor car as a demon sent from the underworld to steal their jobs. When a Ford chugged down the street, emitting a sound like a Gatling gun and a smell like a kerosene lamp on fire, the local equines would react by rearing up, bolting, or attempting to climb the nearest fence. In some towns, the laws were so strict that a motorist had to stop his car, turn off the engine, and wait for a horse to pass. And if the horse was particularly nervous, the driver might be required to dismantle the car and hide the pieces in the bushes until the animal felt safe. The birth of the common man's car. What set Henry Ford apart from the dozens of other car manufacturers sprouting up like weeds in 1903, companies with names like Winton, Oldsmobile, and Packard, was his target audience. Most makers viewed the automobile as a luxury toy for the Gilded Age elite, something to be driven by a man in a raccoon skin coat and goggles. Henry, however, looked at the millions of farmers and shopkeepers and realized that they were tired of feeding horses. He wanted to build a car for the great multitude. He wanted a machine that was simple enough for a man with a hammer to fix and cheap enough for a man with a steady job to buy. In its first year, the Ford Motor Company sold 1,708 cars. It was a staggering success. By the end of 1903, the company was actually profitable. Henry had finally proven that his third time was, indeed, the charm. He had transitioned from a crank with an engine to a captain of industry, though he still spent most of his time in the shop with grease under his fingernails, arguing with the Dodge brothers about the tensile strength of a bolt. The sunset of the stable. The success of the 1903 Ford was the beginning of the end for the old world. The blacksmiths began to look nervously at the mechanics. The buggy whip makers started considering a career in leather belt production. And the horses of the world began to realize that their retirement was going to be much sooner and much more permanent than they had anticipated. Henry Ford hadn't just built a company, he had ignited a fuse. Within a few years, he would perfect the assembly line and introduce the Model T. But the foundation was laid in that drafty wagon shop in 1903. He had taken the horseless carriage and turned it into an American necessity. But Henry wasn't the only one putting engines on things that didn't want them. While Ford was conquering the four-wheeled world in Detroit, two fellows in Milwaukee were busy looking at a bicycle and wondering if they could make it twice as loud and 3 times as dangerous. Chapter 8, Harley and Davidson's Backyard Shed, or The Birth of the Greasy Philosopher. If there is one constant in the history of human progress, it is our unwavering, almost religious commitment to finding new ways to avoid walking. We have domesticated the horse, invented the steam engine, and built the bicycle, yet even the bicycle, that elegant triumph of efficiency, required the one thing a true visionary loathes: physical exertion. To a certain breed of man in 1903, the act of pedaling was not exercise, it was a personal failure of the imagination. While Henry Ford was in Detroit trying to turn the carriage into a parlor on wheels, 2 young men in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, were looking at the bicycle and thinking, "This is wonderful, but it would be much better if it made a deafening noise and smelled like a lamp oil explosion." These two were William S. Harley, a 21-year-old with a penchant for drafting, and Arthur Davidson, a 20-year-old who possessed the kind of mechanical optimism that usually ends in a trip to the local infirmary. Their factory was a wooden shed measuring 10 by 15 feet, built by Arthur's father, a man who likely just wanted the boys to stop getting grease on the kitchen table. Across the door, they had painted the words Harley-Davidson Motor Company in a fit of aspirational branding that was about 80% ambition and 20% wet paint. The gospel of the motorized kite. The concept of the motorcycle was not entirely new in 1903, but it was certainly not yet a respectable way to travel. It was viewed as a motorized kite for people who found the ordinary bicycle too safe and the automobile too expensive. Most early motorcycles were simply standard bicycle frames with a small engine bolted to them in a way that suggested the engine was trying to escape. Harley and Davidson's first attempt followed this tradition. They built a 116 cubic centimeter engine and mounted it on a bicycle frame. It was a beautiful piece of work, right up until they tried to use it. They discovered, to their immense chagrin, that the engine was so weak it couldn't actually move the bike and the rider up a moderate incline without the rider pedaling furiously. This, of course, defeated the entire purpose of the invention. If one has to pedal, one might as well save the cost of the engine and buy a nice ham sandwich instead. Undeterred, they went back to the shed. They realized that if they wanted to stop pedaling, they needed more than just a motor. They needed a machine. They designed a new, larger engine and a frame that was sturdy enough to keep the rider's teeth from rattling out of his head. This was the Silent Gray Fellow, a name that was half accurate. It was indeed gray. The silent part was a masterpiece of marketing fiction that would have made a patent medicine salesman blush. The architecture of the shed. There is something profoundly American about the backyard shed. It is the secular equivalent of a cathedral, a place where men go to commune with the gods of cast iron and sparks. The Harley-Davidson shed was a cramped, drafty affair, lit by kerosene lamps and populated by a rotating cast of Davidson brothers. There were 3 of them, all seemingly born with a wrench in their hands. In this 10 by 15-foot universe, they weren't just building a bike, they were inventing a lifestyle. They were the pioneers of the Brotherhood of the Wrench. To own a Harley in 1903 was to enter into a pact with the machine. You didn't just ride it, you negotiated with it. You learned its moods, its scents, and its preferred brand of lubricant. You became a greasy philosopher, a man who understood that the meaning of life could often be found by adjusting a carburetor in the rain. By the end of 1903, the factory had produced exactly 3 motorcycles. This was not exactly the kind of mass production that kept Henry Ford awake at night, but it was a start. These 3 bikes were solid, reliable, and, most importantly, they could climb a hill without the rider looking like he was competing in the Tour de France. The philosophy of the Iron Horse. What Harley and Davidson understood, perhaps intuitively, was that the motorcycle appealed to a different part of the human psyche than the car. A car was about the destination. It was a way to get your family to church or your groceries home. A motorcycle was about the process. It was a way to feel the wind, the vibrations, and the occasional pebble in your eye. It offered a sense of freedom that was intimate, dangerous, and utterly addictive. In 1903, the biker had not yet become the leather-clad outlaw of the cinema. He was usually a fellow in a flat cap and a wool coat, looking very much like he was late for a choir rehearsal, but had decided to arrive in the loudest manner possible. However, the seeds of the modern outlaw were there. There is something inherently rebellious about a machine that puts you so close to the road and so far from the respectable safety of a carriage. The Harley-Davidson was the iron horse for a new century. It was for the man who didn't want to sit in a vehicle, but on it. It was for the man who wanted to hear the heartbeat of his machine. And as the silent gray fellow chugged out of that Milwaukee shed and onto the dusty roads of Wisconsin, it announced to the world that the bicycle was no longer just a toy for the athletic. It was a weapon of mass mobility. The legacy of the shed. Eventually, the Harley-Davidson Motor Company would move out of the shed and into a proper factory, but they kept the shed for years as a reminder of where they came from. It was a monument to the idea that you don't need a government grant or a university degree to change the world. You just need a sturdy engine, a few brothers, and a father who doesn't mind you using his tools. The shed was eventually destroyed by a confused janitor in the 1970s, a tragedy that ranks somewhere between the burning of the Library of Alexandria and the cancellation of a good riverboat cruise, but the spirit remains. Every time a middle-aged man buys a leather jacket and starts his engine on a Saturday morning, he is paying homage to those 3 bikes built in a 10-foot shack in 1903. As 1903 progressed, it became clear that the motor age was not a fad. It was a fever. We had bikes with engines, cars with engines, and, as we saw in Kitty Hawk, kites with engines. The only question left was how far these machines could take us. And while the boys in Milwaukee were happy to reach the edge of town, a man in San Francisco was looking at his map and wondering if he could reach the other side of the world, or at least the other side of New Jersey. A note on the confused dog. Before we leave the world of early motoring, we must discuss the first road trip. Because if Henry Ford gave us the car and Harley gave us the soul of the machine, a fellow named Horatio Nelson Jackson gave us the vacation. In 1903, there was no interstate system. There were no motels. There were barely any signs. To drive from San Francisco to New York was viewed as a feat equivalent to trekking across the moon on a pogo stick. But Horatio had a $50 bet to win, a very sturdy Winton touring car, and a goggled pit bull named Bud. It was the first time an American looked at the vast, terrifying expanse of the continent and thought, I bet I can do that in 2 months if I don't run out of tires. Shall we join Horatio and Bud on the first transcontinental auto trip? Or would you rather skip ahead to the new mythology and see how we decided to turn all this newfound speed into entertainment? Perhaps a Nickelodeon is more your speed? Chapter 9. The First Transcontinental Auto Trip, or How to Spend $8,000 to Win $50. In the grand catalog of human endeavors, there is a fine, often invisible line between pioneering vision and expensive insanity. In 1903, a Vermont physician named Horatio Nelson Jackson stepped over that line with the enthusiasm of a man who had just discovered that his life was far too quiet and his bank account far too full. The modern road trip is a sanitized affair involving air-conditioned cocoons, satellite navigation that politely suggests you turn left into a cornfield, and a selection of snacks that contain more plastic than the dashboard. But in 1903, the road trip was less a vacation and more a maritime expedition conducted over land in a vehicle that possessed the structural integrity of a motorized lawn chair. The most expensive bet in San Francisco. It all began at the University Club in San Francisco. Jackson, a man who clearly possessed a surplus of confidence and a shortage of hobbies, got into an argument with some fellow gentlemen. The debate was over whether the automobile, that devil wagon we've been discussing, could actually cross the North American continent. The consensus among the club's armchair experts was that it was impossible. There were no transcontinental highways. There were barely any roads at all once you left the city limits of San Francisco, unless you counted dry creek beds and the occasional path cleared by a particularly ambitious cow. Jackson, fueled by either high-quality bourbon or a genetic predisposition for stubbornness, bet $50 that he could drive from San Francisco to New York in less than 90 days. To put this in perspective, Jackson spent roughly $8,000 of his own money to win that $50 bet. This is the kind of mathematical genius that built the American economy, a system where we spend thousands to prove a point to people we don't particularly like. The crew, a mechanic and a mascot. Jackson knew nothing about fixing cars, which is the first prerequisite for a successful 1903 motorist. He hired Sewall Crocker, a young mechanic who possessed the patience of a saint and the ability to rebuild an engine using a pocket knife and a piece of string. They purchased a used 1903 Winton touring car, which Jackson named the Vermont. It was a 20-horsepower machine with 2 cylinders and a chain drive. It had no windshield, no roof, and no doors. It was essentially a very fast sofa. They stripped it of its tonneau, the back seat, to make room for spare tires, tools, sleeping bags, and enough gasoline to fuel a small war. But the most important member of the crew was added in Idaho. Feeling that the expedition lacked a certain je ne sais quoi, Jackson purchased a pit bull puppy for $15. He named the dog Bud. Bud quickly became the face of the journey because the dusty trails of the West caused the dog's eyes to become irritated. Jackson did the only sensible thing. He fitted the puppy with a pair of custom-made driving goggles. Thus, the image of a goggled dog sitting stoically in a chugging Winton became the first viral sensation in American history. Decades before the internet existed, we had already peaked with Dog and Sunglasses, The Roads of the West. The journey began on May 23rd, 1903. Jackson and Crocker decided to head north into Oregon rather than tackle the Nevada desert, which at the time was essentially a giant sandbox where cars went to die. The roads they encountered were masterpieces of natural obstacle courses. In many places, the path was simply the tracks left by a wagon. And since wagons have a different wheel width than a Winton, the car spent most of its time tilted at a 45-degree angle, threatening to tip over and crush its occupants into the sagebrush. When it rained, the West turned into a substance that Jackson described as gumbo mud. It was a thick, adhesive sludge that could stop a 20-horsepower engine in its tracks. They spent days using a block and tackle, a system of pulleys and ropes, to haul the Vermont out of one mud hole, only to have it slide gracefully into the next 150 feet later. They were less driving across America and more winching America beneath them. The perils of local directions. One of the greatest hazards of the trip was the local populace. In 1903, rural Americans had seen steam trains, but many had never seen a car. To them, Jackson and Crocker looked like visitors from Mars who had arrived in a noisy, stinking chariot. Jackson frequently stopped to ask for directions. On one occasion, a woman directed them down a remote path that ended abruptly at a farmhouse. When they asked her why she had sent them there, she confessed that she wanted her family to see the automobile, and this was the only way to ensure they get a good look at it. Jackson was being used as a mobile circus act, and he didn't even get a cut of the ticket sales. Other locals, in a display of early American entrepreneurial spirit, would purposefully misdirect the travelers, so they would have to double back and pass through the town again, allowing more people to see the spectacle. It turns out that being a pioneer is mostly about being a tourist attraction for people who are bored. The Great Race. That wasn't. As word of Jackson's progress reached the East Coast via telegraph, the auto industry realized that a successful crossing would be the greatest advertisement in history. The Packard Company and the Oldsmobile Company, horrified that a privateer in a used Winton was going to take all the glory, frantically dispatched their own professional drivers to beat him. Suddenly, the quiet plains of Nebraska were transformed into a low-speed, high-stress race. Jackson, however, had a head start and a goggled dog. He wasn't about to lose his $50, despite breaking his front axle twice, losing his cooking gear once, and running out of gas in the middle of nowhere frequently. He kept moving. When they ran out of fuel, Crocker would often have to walk 20 miles to the nearest town, buy a few gallons of kerosene or gasoline at a general store, and lug it back through the heat. Arrival in the Big Apple. On July 26, 1903, 63 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes after leaving San Francisco, the Vermont rattled into New York City. The car was held together by wire, hope, and several layers of dust from 15 different states. Bud the dog was still wearing his goggles, though he was likely wondering when this brief stroll was going to end. They were greeted by a cheering crowd and a swarm of reporters. Jackson had won his bet. He had proven that the automobile was not just a city toy, but a machine capable of conquering a continent. He had also proven that if you have enough money and a very good mechanic, you can turn a 63-day nightmare into a legendary achievement. The verdict of the highway. Jackson's trip was the birth of the American road trip. He demonstrated that the joy of the journey is not in the destination, but in the number of times you have to pull your vehicle out of a ditch with a rope. He never collected the $50. The man who made the bet never paid up, which is perhaps the most authentic ending to a story about a gentleman's wager in history. Jackson didn't care. He had the Vermont, he had the fame, and he had a dog that was now more famous than most members of Congress. As the Vermont sat cooling its tires in New York, 1903 was reaching its midpoint. We had conquered the sky, the dirt, and the distance. But while we were busy moving around, we were also looking for a way to stay still and be entertained. And for that, we needed a nickel, a dark room, and a very large man with a very large gun pointing it directly at our faces. Chapter 10. The First World Series, or The Audacity of the Global Asterisk. Man is the only animal that finds it necessary to strike a leather-bound sphere with a wooden club and then proceed to run in a frantic, dusty circle until he returns to exactly where he started. In any other context, this would be viewed as a symptom of a nervous breakdown. In America, it is viewed as a spiritual necessity and a legitimate excuse to avoid doing chores on a Tuesday afternoon. By 1903, the game of baseball had graduated from a rowdy pastime for drunkards and soldiers into a slightly more organized rowdy pastime for professionals. But it lacked a climax. It was a story with many chapters but no ending, a feast with many courses but no dessert. The two competing leagues, the crusty established National League and the upstart swaggering American League, had spent the previous 2 years engaged in a bitter trade war that involved more stealing than a pirates' convention. Eventually, the owners realized that they were losing more money on lawyers than they were making on peanuts. They signed a peace treaty, and to celebrate this sudden outbreak of sanity, they decided to stage a grand finale, a World's Championship Series. I have always admired the American gift for nomenclature. To call a contest between a team from Boston and a team from Pittsburgh a World Series implies a certain geographical optimism that would baffle a cartographer. At the time, the rest of the world was busy playing cricket, fighting smallpox, or attempting to understand the rules of rugby, a game which consists largely of men forming a sweaty pile and hoping for the best. But in the mind of the 1903 American, if it happened between the Atlantic and the Pacific, it was the world. The rest of the planet was simply a vast, unscouted wilderness that lacked proper concessions. The War of the Leagues. The contestants for this inaugural global event were the Pittsburgh Pirates, champions of the National League, and the Boston Americans, who would later become the Red Sox, presumably because they ran out of laundry detergent for their hosiery. The Pirates were the heavy favorites. They featured a man named Honus Wagner, also known as the Flying Dutchman. Honus was a man who appeared to have been assembled from the parts of several different, much larger men. He had bowed legs, hands the size of dinner plates, and a way of playing shortstop that suggested he was personally offended by the existence of the ball. The Boston Americans were led by a living legend, Cy Young. Cy was 36 years old in 1903, an age which in the early 20th century was considered roughly halfway to the grave. He was called Cy because his fastball was said to be as destructive as a cyclone. He was a farm boy who threw the ball with the relentless mechanical precision of a steam engine. He didn't believe in pitch counts or rest days. He believed in throwing a ball until the sun went down or the batter went home, whichever happened first. The Royal Rooters and the power of musical torture. The series began in Boston at the Huntington Avenue grounds. Because 1903 was a year of excess, the owners decided that a best-of-5 or best-of-7 series was simply too brief. They settled on a best-of-9 format. It was a marathon of endurance that tested the liver of every fan and the legs of every player. However, the most formidable weapon in the Boston arsenal was not Cy Young's arm, but a group of fans known as the Royal Rooters. Led by a barkeeper named Nuff Said McGreevy, these gentlemen were to sportsmanship what a hurricane is to a picnic. They occupied the front rows, drank copious amounts of beer, and engaged in a form of psychological warfare that would be banned by the Geneva Convention today. Their primary weapon was a song from a Broadway musical called The Silver Slipper. The song was titled Tessie. Now, Tessie was a perfectly lovely, sentimental tune about a girl and her parakeet, or something equally innocuous. But the rooters adapted the lyrics to insult the Pittsburgh players. They sang it incessantly. They sang it during the wind-up. They sang it during the hit. They sang it while the Pittsburgh players were trying to eat their dinner. By Game 3, the Pittsburgh players were reportedly humming Tessie in their sleep and waking up screaming. Honus Wagner, the greatest player of his generation, was so unnerved by the singing and the verbal abuse that his batting average began to plummet like a lead balloon in a vacuum. It was the first recorded instance of a Broadway show tune being used as a tactical deterrent. The Best of 9 saga. The series was a seesaw of momentum. Pittsburgh took a 3-1 lead, and it looked as though the world would belong to the Smoky City. But then the series moved back to Boston, and the combination of Cy Young's pitching and the Rooters' vocal cords began to take its toll. The playing conditions were, by modern standards, a nightmare. There were no outfield walls in the way we think of them today. Instead, the overflow crowds were allowed to stand on the field, held back only by a thin rope. If a ball was hit into the crowd, it was a ground rule double. This meant that a player's success often depended on whether the fans liked him enough to get out of the way or if they preferred to trip him as he ran past. In Game 8, the finale, the Boston Americans finally put the Pirates out of their misery. They won the game 3-0, clinching the series 5-3. The upstart American League had humbled the established National League. The world, consisting of 2 states and a bit of Pennsylvania, had a champion. The verdict of the diamond. The 1903 World Series changed the American psyche. It proved that we didn't need kings, queens, or ancient traditions to feel a sense of national destiny. We just needed a scorecard and a bitter rivalry. It established baseball as the national pastime, a phrase that implies the entire country has nothing better to do than argue about the infield fly rule. For the players, the rewards were modest. Each member of the winning Boston team received about $1,100. The losing Pittsburgh players actually received more, about $1,300, because their owner, Barney Dreyfuss, was so moved by their effort that he gave them his share of the gate receipts. This is the last time in human history that a sports owner showed such a level of financial generosity, and the shock of it nearly caused the sporting press to faint. Honus Wagner left Boston in a huff, likely with the melody of Tessie still ringing in his ears. Cy Young went back to his farm, probably to throw rocks at a barn until the following spring, and the fans went home, secure in the knowledge that they were the masters of the world. As the dust settled on the Huntington Avenue grounds, the curse that would haunt Boston for the next 86 years hadn't even been packed in its suitcase yet. That would come later, with the sale of a fellow named Ruth. In 1903, it was all sunshine, beer, and the glorious realization that if you hit a ball hard enough, you can make an entire city forget its troubles for an afternoon. The shadows of the nickel. But while 10,000 people were screaming at a ballpark, others were gathering in much smaller, much darker rooms. They were discovering that you didn't need to go to a stadium to see a spectacle. You just needed a nickel and a willingness to sit in the dark while a machine projected dreams onto a sheet. The new mythology was moving from the field to the screen. And in 1903, a man named Edwin S. Porter was about to show the world that a camera could do more than just record life. It could lie to you in the most entertaining way possible. Shall we head to the theater? I hear there's a train robbery in progress, and the lead outlaw has a very itchy trigger finger aimed directly at the audience. Chapter 11, The Great Train Robbery, or The Moment Humanity Volunteered to be Terrified for a Nickel. If the 19th century was an era of the written word, a time when a man had to possess a functioning imagination and a decent reading lamp to be entertained, the 20th century was the moment we decided that thinking was far too much work. We wanted our stories delivered directly to our eyeballs at 24 frames per second, preferably with as little intellectual heavy lifting as possible. Before 1903, the moving picture was less of an art form and more of a technological parlor trick, the sort of thing you'd see at a carnival between the two-headed calf and the man who could swallow a saber. Thomas Edison, a man who never met a patent he didn't want to own, had given us the kinetoscope, but the movies themselves were remarkably dull. They were called actualities. You would pay a penny to stand in a dark room and watch a flickering, grainy loop of a man sneezing, or a baby eating porridge, or a steam engine pulling into a station. The most famous of these early films showed a train coming directly at the camera. Legend has it that audiences in 1896 screamed and scrambled to the back of the room, convinced that several tons of iron were about to burst through the sheet and crush them into the floorboards. It was a charming display of Victorian innocence. But once you've seen a man sneeze 6 times in a row, the novelty begins to wear thin. The world was ready for a story, it was ready for drama, it was ready for a robbery. Edwin S. Porter and the 12-minute epic. In 1903, a former telegraph operator turned filmmaker named Edwin S. Porter decided that the camera shouldn't just stand there like a confused cow watching a fence. He realized that you could move the camera, you could cut between different scenes, and, most radically, you could tell a lie. He gathered a group of actors who were mostly just people who didn't mind being cold and dusty for a few days, and headed to the wilds of New Jersey, which in 1903 was apparently a convincing stand-in for the American West. The result was The Great Train Robbery. It was 12 minutes long. Today, 12 minutes is the length of a particularly long commercial for insurance or a video of a cat failing to jump onto a counter. But in 1903, 12 minutes was an odyssey. It was a sprawling, multi-perspective epic that featured a heist, a chase, a shootout, and a moral reckoning. It was the first Western, and it established the template for every action movie that would follow for the next century. If you've ever sat through a film featuring a man walking away from an explosion without looking back, you can thank Edwin S. Porter and the New Jersey woods. The plot: crime and quick punishment. The film begins with 2 masked bandits entering a telegraph office and forcing the operator to halt a train. They knock him out, tie him up, and head for the locomotive. What follows is a masterpiece of early cinematic violence. The bandits board the train, blow open a safe with explosives, which looked remarkably like a small puff of flour and a very enthusiastic stagehand, and proceed to rob the passengers. Porter introduced cross-cutting, which was a revolutionary concept at the time. He showed the bandits making their escape, and then he cut back to the telegraph office to show the operator's daughter discovering her father and untying him. This suggested that two things were happening at the same time, a concept that nearly broke the brains of the 1903 audience. They had to learn, in real time, how to read a new visual language. They had to understand that the girl wasn't a ghost appearing in a different room, but a separate part of the same story. The film ends with a classic posse-led shootout in the woods. The bandits are dispatched, the money is recovered, and the law is upheld. It was a tidy, satisfying narrative that lasted about as long as it takes to boil an egg. But it was the final shot that changed everything. The gunshot heard round the Nickelodeon. After the story had concluded, Porter added a bonus shot that had nothing to do with the plot. It featured the leader of the outlaws, a man named Justus D. Barnes, looking directly into the camera. He slowly raises his large-caliber revolver, points it directly at the audience, and fires. You have to remember that in 1903, the fourth wall was not a wall. It was a sacred boundary. People did not point guns at audiences. When Barnes pulled the trigger, the effect was cataclysmic. People in the front rows dived under their seats. Women fainted. Grown men, veterans of the Civil War who had seen actual lead flying across actual fields, flinched and ducked. It was the first jump scare. It was a moment of pure, visceral manipulation. Porter had discovered the secret to the box office. If you can make a man feel like he's about to die while he's safely eating a bag of popcorn, he will give you every nickel he owns. The rise of the Nickelodeon. The success of the Great Train Robbery was so absolute that it sparked a national phenomenon. Across the country, entrepreneurs began converting empty storefronts, cigar shops, and even stables into tiny theaters. They called them Nickelodeons, a portmanteau of nickel, the cost of admission, and Odeon, the Greek word for theater. The Nickelodeon was the most democratic institution in America. It didn't care about your social standing, your education, or whether you could speak English. For 5 cents, a dock worker could sit next to a banker's wife in the dark and be equally terrified by a New Jersey outlaw. The movies were silent, which meant they were a universal language. An immigrant from Italy and an immigrant from Poland could both understand a punch to the jaw or a falling safe without needing a translator. By the end of 1903, the flickers were no longer a fad. They were an industry. We had discovered that humanity has a bottomless appetite for fiction, especially when it involves trains, guns, and the thrill of a narrow escape. We had traded the quiet dignity of the theater for the flickering shadows of the screen, and we were never going back. The verdict of the flicker. As I watched the world change from my porch, I couldn't help but wonder what this would do to us. If we could be entertained by shadows, would we still care about the light? If we could see a robbery for a nickel, would we still have the patience for a 3-volume novel? But then I thought about that outlaw pointing his gun at the crowd. There is something profoundly human about wanting to be scared when you know you're safe. It's the same reason we tell ghost stories around a campfire or ride those rickety roller coasters at the fair. We want to feel the adrenaline without the actual risk of a funeral. 1903 was the year we learned how to dream collectively in the dark. We had conquered the air with the Wrights, the distance with Horatio Jackson, and the map with Teddy Roosevelt. But with the great train robbery, we conquered the one thing more vast than the ocean or the sky, the human imagination. And while the outlaws were firing their guns on the screen a few blocks away, a child was likely opening a small yellow box and discovering a different kind of magic. 8 sticks of colored wax that would allow him to draw his own outlaws on the parlor wallpaper. The domestic revolution. Shall we leave the dark theaters and head to the kitchen table? 1903 wasn't just about big machines and global heists. It was about the small things that changed our homes. For 5 cents, a child could buy a box of Crayola crayons, and for another nickel, their father could buy a bottle of Pepsi Cola. Would you like to explore the birth of the wax empire and the sugary rise of the soft drink? Or are you more interested in the Sears Roebuck catalog, the Amazon of 1903 that could deliver a tombstone and a corset to your front door in the same crate? Chapter 12, The Wizard of Oz on Broadway, or The Mystery of the Disappearing Dog. In 1903, the American public was suffering from a collective case of reality fatigue. We had spent the first few years of the century looking at grease, mud, steam engines, and Theodore Roosevelt's teeth. It was all very impressive, but it was also very loud and tended to leave one with a persistent coating of soot. People wanted to go somewhere where the laws of physics were merely suggestions, and the local residents didn't ask for your credentials before bursting into song. They found that place at the Majestic Theater in New York. L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz had been a bestseller in 1900. But in 1903, it arrived on Broadway as a musical extravaganza that would have made a modern purist clutch their pearls until they crumbled into dust. If you are a citizen of the future, your understanding of Oz is likely colored by a certain 1939 film involving a young lady in gingham and a very small dog. But the 1903 Broadway version was a different beast entirely, a production that viewed the source material not as a sacred text, but as a rough suggestion that could be improved with the addition of vaudeville jokes, political satire, and a complete disregard for biological accuracy. The Great Species, Swap, Farewell Toto, Hello Imogene. The most striking difference, and the one that would cause a modern toddler to weep in confusion, was the fate of Toto. In the book, Toto is a small black dog who provides Dorothy with companionship and an excuse to talk to herself. On the 1903 Broadway stage, however, a dog was considered a theatrical liability. Dogs are difficult to train, they have a tendency to wander off into the orchestra pit, and they rarely follow the choreography unless there is a significant amount of bacon involved. The producer's solution was simple, elegant, and utterly insane. They replaced the dog with a cow. Her name was Imogene. She was played by a man in a velvet and canvas suit who possessed a remarkable talent for pantomime. Why a cow? Because in the world of 1903 theater, a man in a cow suit was considered high-level comedy. Imogene didn't bark. She mooed, she danced, and she provided a convenient platform for the scarecrow to lean on. It was a master class in the vaudeville logic of the era. If you can't make it realistic, make it a farm animal and hope for the best. The audience didn't mind. In fact, they loved it. Imogene became a sensation, proving that the American public was perfectly willing to accept a bovine companion on a journey down a yellow brick road, provided the cow could do a decent soft shoe routine. The stars of the show, slapstick as high art. The real reason The Wizard of Oz became the hit of 1903 was the casting of Fred Stone and David Montgomery as the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman. In the book, these characters are poignant figures searching for a brain and a heart. On Broadway, they were a world-class comedy duo who specialized in what we now call physical comedy, and what was then called trying not to die on stage. Fred Stone, the Scarecrow. Stone was a marvel of rubber-limbed acrobatics. He didn't just walk, he collapsed, folded, and reconstituted himself with every step, perfectly capturing the essence of a man made entirely of straw and optimism. He would stumble over his own feet, fall into a pile of himself, and then bounce back up like a spring. David Montgomery, the Tin Woodman. Montgomery's woodman was a clanking, stiff-jointed foil. He was the straight man to Stone's chaotic energy, providing a rhythmic, metallic counterpoint to the Scarecrow's frantic flailing. Together, they turned the journey to the Emerald City into a series of elaborate pratfalls and witty banter that had very little to do with the plot and everything to do with the fact that people in 1903 really liked seeing a man in a tin suit fall over. They were the engine of the show, driving the narrative forward through sheer force of personality and the occasional well-timed thud. Oz as a mirror. Satire for the seated. What is most fascinating about the 1903 Oz is that it wasn't strictly for children. It was a spectacle for all ages, which is theatrical code for we've added a lot of jokes about the government so the parents don't fall asleep. The wizard himself was portrayed not as a terrifying humbug, but as a bumbling, wisecracking politician. The script was frequently updated to include jabs at the current events of 1903. There were jokes about the Panama Canal, the favorite punchline of the year. The wizard would often comment on the ease of building a country in an afternoon. The Alaska boundary dispute, jokes about how cold it was in the frozen north and how the British were acting like flying monkeys. The big stick, a recurring theme, as the wizard's primary method of governance appeared to be a mixture of bluster and Theodore Roosevelt impressions. The Emerald City wasn't just a magical destination. It was a satirical mirror of Washington, D.C., complete with bureaucracy, ego, and a healthy dose of cynicism. It was a uniquely American take on fantasy, one that admitted that even in a world with munchkins, you probably still can't get a building permit without bribing a local official. The spectacle and the staff. The production was a triumph of 1903 stagecraft. This was the era of the extravaganza, where the goal was to overwhelm the senses until the audience forgot they had to go home to a drafty apartment. The cyclone scene was a masterpiece of mechanical ingenuity. Huge fans blew dust and leaves into the audience, while the stage spun and groaned with the sound of 1,000 cracking timbers. People actually clutched their programs expecting to be transported to Kansas, or at least to the nearest exit. Anonymous Theater Critic, 1903. The sets were made of staff, that same mixture of plaster and hemp used at the World's Fair, which allowed for massive, ornate palaces that could be moved around by a small army of stagehands. It was a world built of illusion, held together by glue, spit, and the sheer audacity of the producers. The play was also notable for its poppy field scene, which featured dozens of dancers in vibrant red costumes, creating a visual feast that compensated for the fact that the actual plot of the book had been largely discarded in favor of a subplot involving a usurped throne and a character named Pastoria, who was the rightful King of Oz. Because apparently, a simple story about a girl trying to go home wasn't complicated enough for Broadway. The Verdict of the Velvet Curtain. The play was a colossal success. It ran for 293 performances on Broadway, a staggering number for the time, and then toured the country for years. It was the Hamilton of its day, provided Hamilton involved a man in a cow suit and a lot more jokes about the price of coal. It also introduced the concept of the Oz brand. Baum realized that he had stumbled upon a gold mine. He began churning out sequels, but he always kept one eye on the theater. He understood that the American public didn't just want a story, they wanted an experience. They wanted the lights, the costumes, the music, and the feeling that for 2 hours the dusty reality of the 20th century could be held at bay by a chorus line of poppies and a dancing cow. As I sat in the dim light of the theater, metaphorically speaking, of course, I marveled at the transformation. We had taken a simple Midwestern fairy tale and turned it into a high-gloss, satirical, cow-infested extravaganza. It was proof that 1903 was the year of the new mythology. We were no longer satisfied with the old gods. We were building our own legends out of tin, straw, and stage lights. 1903 reminded us that even as we were hurtling toward a future of steel and monopoly, there was still a place in our hearts for a man in a velvet cowsuit. It was a reminder that humanity's greatest invention isn't the light bulb or the steam engine. It's the ability to laugh at ourselves while pretending to be in a forest made of cardboard. Chapter 13. Crayola and the Wax Empire, or the Colonization of the Parlor Wallpaper. If the first 12 chapters of 1903 have taught us anything, it is that humanity was suffering from a desperate, pent-up need to make a mess. We were digging ditches in Panama, flinging mechanics off sand dunes in North Carolina, and splashing expensive aerodromes into the Potomac. But while the adults were busy rearranging the geography of the planet, the children of America were facing a much more localized crisis. They had a world of imagination and absolutely nothing to draw it with. Before the dawn of the 20th century, a child's artistic toolkit was a grim affair. If you were a small person with a creative spark, you were largely limited to charcoal, stolen from the stove, a piece of lead that probably wasn't doing your nervous system any favors, or a bit of slate pencil that made a sound capable of curdling milk. It was a monochromatic existence. Art was for the wealthy, for the trained, and for people who didn't mind smelling like turpentine. The average American child's color palette consisted of dirt brown, soot gray, and the occasional bruise purple. Then came Binney and Smith. From Barnes to bestsellers. The firm of Binney and Smith, located in Easton, Pennsylvania, did not start out with the intention of becoming the patron saints of the kindergarten set. Edward Binney and C. Harold Smith were in the business of industrial pigments. They made the lamp black that went into tires and the red iron oxide that painted every barn in the American countryside. If it was dark, industrial, and stayed where you put it, Binney and Smith probably had a hand in it. But around the turn of the century, they noticed a gap in the market. Schools were in desperate need of a writing implement that didn't involve a messy inkwell or a screeching slate. They successfully developed a dustless school chalk, which won a gold medal at the St. Louis World's Fair. An event we've established was the Oscars, for things that didn't explode. However, their greatest epiphany came when they looked at the wax crayons of the day. These were chunky, greasy sticks used in factories to mark crates and barrels. They were black, they were smelly, and they were toxic enough to kill a horse. Binney and Smith looked at these industrial markers and had a thought that could only occur to a pair of savvy capitalists. What if we made these pretty, made them safe, and sold them to children? The genius of Alice Binney. While Edward and Harold provided the wax and the pigment, the soul of the company belonged to Alice Binney. A former school teacher and Edward's wife, Alice, understood something the men did not. A product is only as good as its name. Binney's colored wax sticks for industrial and scholastic use was a name that inspired boredom. Alice wanted something that sang. She took the French word for chalk, cray, and combined it with the root of the word for oily or fatty, oléagineux, Crayola. It was a stroke of marketing genius. It sounded French, which suggested a certain artistic pedigree. Yet it was easy for a child to say between bites of a graham cracker. It transformed an industrial byproduct into a household necessity. The box of 8, a 5-cent revolution. In 1903, the first box of Crayola crayons hit the shelves. It was a modest yellow and green box that cost exactly 1 nickel. Inside were 8 colors that would become the foundational vocabulary of American childhood: black, brown, orange, violet, blue, green, red, yellow. To a modern child, 8 colors is an insult, a starter pack for a particularly unimaginative toddler. We live in an era of sunset shimmer and atomic tangerine, where a box of 64 is considered the bare minimum for a decent rendering of a cat. But in 1903, 8 colors was a revolution. It was the democratization of art. For 5 cents, a child could own a rainbow. They no longer had to wait for a sunset to see color. They could manufacture their own on the back of a grocery receipt. The Great Wallpaper War of 1903. However, the arrival of the crayon brought with it a new and terrifying domestic conflict. You see, a child with a crayon is a child with a mission, and that mission is rarely confined to a designated piece of paper. The Victorian parlor was a place of high-stakes interior design. It featured ornate wallpaper with floral patterns, velvet curtains, and a general atmosphere of "don't touch anything." The 1903 Crayola was essentially a weapon of mass decoration. It was wax-based, which meant it was waterproof, smudge-proof, and, most importantly, nearly impossible to remove from a floral patterned wall without taking the wall with it. Across the nation, mothers walked into their parlors to find that their expensive imported wallpaper had been improved by a 3-foot-tall avant-garde artist. A landscape of yellow suns and violet cows suddenly appeared at knee height throughout the Republic. 1903 was the year that scrubbing the walls became a national pastime. Binney and Smith had promised non-toxic crayons, and they were, physically speaking. Mentally, however, the sight of a red Crayola sun on a white silk wall was enough to drive a Victorian matron to the brink of a nervous breakdown. The legacy of the wax empire. What Binney and Smith actually invented in 1903 was the concept of quiet time. They discovered that if you give a child a box of wax sticks and a surface, they will remain silent for upwards of 20 minutes. This was a gift to the American parent that was worth far more than a nickel. It was the precursor to the television, the tablet, and every other device we have since invented to ensure our children stop asking us why for a few moments. By the end of 1903, Crayola was no longer an experiment. It was an institution. It proved that the 20th century was going to be an era of mass-produced joy. We were moving away from the useful and toward the expressive. We decided that a child's vision of the world, no matter how messy or anatomically incorrect, was worth 5 cents and a bit of ruined wallpaper. As the year drew to a close, the wax empire was firmly established. Binney and Smith began adding more colors, more boxes, and more specialized tools, eventually leading to the built-in sharpener, a piece of engineering that ranks somewhere just below the steam engine in terms of human utility. But in 1903, it was all very simple. 8 colors, 1 box, and a world that was suddenly a lot more vibrant. The children of America were finally coloring in the lines, or, more accurately, ignoring the lines entirely and drawing a blue horse on the side of the piano. The verdict of the palette. We often think of history in terms of treaties signed by men in top hats, but history is also written in the wax marks on a nursery floor. 1903 gave us the Panama Canal to move our ships and the Wright flyer to move our bodies, but it gave us the Crayola crayon to move our minds. It taught us that color is not a luxury. It is a right. It taught us that a nickel can buy a ticket to a world where cows are purple and the sun is orange and the only limit is the height of the wainscoting. And while the adults were busy worrying about the big stick policy, the children were busy mastering the big stick of red wax policy. It was a colorful, messy, and utterly delightful start to the century. But man cannot live on wax alone. He requires sugar. He requires caffeine. He requires a pharmacist in North Carolina with a dream and a very large copper kettle. Chapter 14. The Pepsi-Cola Incorporation, or The Sweet Science of the Jittery Pharmacist. By the middle of 1903, the American citizenry was becoming remarkably well acquainted with the concept of the future. And frankly, the future was starting to give everyone a bit of a headache. We had bicycles that flew, cars that exploded, and children who were currently coloring the family dog a vibrant shade of Crayola violet. It was a frantic, soot-covered age, and the collective digestive system of the Republic was beginning to stage a protest. In those days, if your stomach felt like it had been used as a practice field for a rugby match, you didn't go to a hospital. You went to the local pharmacy. The drugstore of 1903 was not the sterile, fluorescent-lit warehouse of the modern era where one buys thumb drives and discounted Halloween candy. It was a sensory extravaganza of mahogany, marble, and mysterious glass jars filled with things that either cured you or ensured you'd never worry about being sick again by virtue of being dead. At the center of this alchemical kingdom, sat the soda fountain. This was a laboratory of the common man, presided over by a pharmacist who was part chemist, part bartender, and part amateur philosopher. And in New Bern, North Carolina, a pharmacist named Caleb Bradham was about to prove that the most successful medicine in the world wasn't something that tasted like a pine tree's socks, but something that tasted like a liquid carnival. The evolution of Brad's drink. Caleb Bradham had been tinkering with a concoction in his drugstore for nearly a decade. For years, the locals had been dropping in to ask for a glass of Brad's drink. Now, Brad's drink is a name that suggests a certain lack of marketing ambition. It sounds like something your neighbor gives you to help strip the paint off your porch. It lacks the pizzazz necessary to conquer a continent. But Caleb was a man of the new century. He looked at his mixture of sugar, water, caramel, lemon oil, nutmeg, and other secret aromatics, and he realized he wasn't just selling a beverage, he was selling invigoration. In 1903, he officially incorporated the Pepsi-Cola Company. The name was a masterstroke of early 20th century pseudoscience. It was derived from pepsin, a digestive enzyme, and the cola nut, which provided the caffeine necessary to make a person feel like they could personally hand-crank a steam locomotive. The brilliance of the name lay in its medical masquerade. By calling it Pepsi, Bradham was subtly suggesting that by drinking this brown, fizzy sugar water, you were actually performing a vital service for your stomach. You weren't indulging in a treat. You were aiding digestion. It was a guilt-free indulgence, the secular equivalent of eating a salad that happens to be made entirely of bacon. The patent medicine paradox. To understand why Pepsi-Cola exploded onto the scene in 1903, one must understand the patent medicine era. This was a time when the American public was obsessed with their shattered nerves and sluggish blood. The Industrial Revolution had made us all a bit twitchy, and we were looking for a cure in a bottle. At the time, the lines between medicine and refreshment were blurrier than a tintype photograph taken during an earthquake. Coca-Cola, Pepsi's older and more established rival, had already set the stage by marketing itself as a brain tonic. And let's be honest, in its early days, Coca-Cola contained a certain botanical ingredient derived from the coca leaf that would certainly make one's brain feel like it was being polished with sandpaper. Bradham's Pepsi-Cola entered the fray with a bold claim: exhilarating, invigorating, aids digestion. The 1903 marketing campaign didn't focus on the flavor, which was, to be fair, brown and sweet. It focused on the effect. It promised to cure your dyspepsia, settle your nerves, and give you the energy to survive a 12-hour shift in a textile mill. It was the original energy drink, but instead of being sold in a neon-colored can featuring a lightning bolt, it was served in a graceful glass bottle with a logo that looked like it had been hand-lettered by a particularly elegant ghost. The incorporation, from the back room to the boardroom. On the day of incorporation in 1903, the Pepsi-Cola Company was not a global behemoth with a halftime show at the Super Bowl. It was Caleb Bradham, a few investors, and a very large copper kettle. The process of incorporating was a sign that the American entrepreneur was growing up. We were moving away from the lone inventor and toward the corporate entity. Caleb realized that he couldn't stir enough syrup by hand to satisfy the growing thirst of the Carolinas. He needed factories, he needed bottling plants, and he needed a logo that would look good on the side of a barn. The first Pepsi-Cola logo was a swirling red script affair that looked remarkably similar to that of his rival in Atlanta. In 1903, branding was a bit like a game of musical chairs. Everyone was trying to sit in the same seat of Victorian elegance. Pepsi-Cola, the original pure food drink. 1903 advertisement. The phrase pure food drink was another tactical maneuver. This was a time when food safety was, let's say, experimental. People were terrified of being poisoned by their sausages or blinded by their milk. By calling his soda a pure food, Caleb was positioning Pepsi as the safe, wholesome alternative to, say, water from a city well that might contain a surprising amount of cholera. The Soda Fountain Social Club. The incorporation of Pepsi in 1903 helped solidify the soda fountain as the third place in American life. That space between work and home where people gathered to discuss the news of the day. Imagine the scene in 1903. You walk into the drugstore, the air thick with the smell of camphor and vanilla. You sit on a high stool, and the soda jerk, so named for the jerking motion used to pull the tap on the carbonated water, asks for your order. You pay your nickel, and he mixes the Pepsi syrup with the fizz right before your eyes. It was a performance. It was a ritual. And in 1903, it was the closest thing the average American had to a luxury experience. For 5 cents, you could feel like a king, or at least like a person whose stomach wasn't currently trying to turn itself inside out. The success of Pepsi proved that the American public was ready to embrace a lifestyle of mass-produced delight. We were a people who wanted our thrills delivered in liquid form, cold, bubbly, and guaranteed to give us a sugar rush that would last until the evening chores were done. The verdict of the fizz. As Caleb Bradham sat in his office in 1903, watching the orders pour in, he likely didn't realize that he had helped ignite a cola war that would span the century. He just knew that he had a product that people liked and a name that sounded like it belonged in a medical textbook. The Pepsi-Cola Incorporation was a victory for the pharmacist-entertainer. It proved that in the 20th century, the best way to get people to take their medicine was to make it taste like caramel and charge them 5 cents for the privilege. We had airplanes for our bodies, crayons for our souls, and now we had Pepsi for our stomachs. We were becoming a nation of carbonated citizens, fueled by caffeine and optimism, ready to tackle the challenges of a new era with a slight tremor in our hands and a very high level of enthusiasm. But while we were busy drinking our sugar, we still had to find a way to buy all the other things we needed. And for that, we needed the Wish book. We needed a 1,000-page tome that could deliver a shotgun, a silk hat, and a tombstone to our door in a single crate. The 1903 Inventory of Excess. Before we move to the catalog, let us reflect on the ingredients of the 1903 Pepsi-Cola: water, hopefully filtered; sugar, a massive amount; caramel, for that medicinal brown color; pepsin, to make you feel like you were being healthy; cola nut, to ensure you couldn't sleep until 1904. It was a drink designed for a nation that was in a hurry to get somewhere. even if they weren't entirely sure where that was. 1903 was the year we realized that life was better when it was fizzy. Chapter 15, The Sears Roebuck Catalog, or the Amazon of the horse and buggy era. If 1903 was the year we learned to fly, it was also the year we learned to sit perfectly still on a porch in Nebraska and summon the entire industrial output of the planet to our front door. While the Wright brothers were wrestling with the wind, a fellow named Richard Warren Sears was wrestling with the much more lucrative problem of human desire. By 1903, the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog had become the secular Bible of the American household. It was a 1,000-page, 4-pound tome of newsprint and dreams that possessed the singular power to make a man living in a sod house feel like he was just a postage stamp away from the lifestyle of a Vanderbilt. It was known as the Wish Book, a title that suggests a level of mystical reverence usually reserved for ancient scrolls or a particularly promising treasure map. The Weight of a Civilization. To understand the 1903 catalog, you must first appreciate its sheer physical gravity. This was not the flimsy, glossy circular you receive today that advertises discounted lawn furniture and immediately goes into the recycling bin. The Sears catalog was a massive, doorstop-sized volume that contained everything a human being could possibly require from the moment of conception to the finality of the grave. In 1903, if you were a farmer in a remote corner of the Dakotas, your local store was a dusty establishment run by a man named Silas, who overcharged you for flour and only had one type of hat, which usually looked like it had been sat upon by a mule. Richard Sears looked at Silas and decided to put him out of his misery. Sears didn't just sell products, he sold the future. He understood that the American people were suffering from a localized version of choice deprivation. By 1903, his catalog offered over 100,000 items. It was the first time in history that a person's social standing was limited only by their bank account and the carrying capacity of the local mail wagon. A department store in a crate, the 1903 inventory. The 1903 catalog was a masterpiece of organized chaos. You could flip through its pages and encounter a sequence of products that defied all logic but satisfied every need. It was a world where a lady could order a corset that promised to reduce her waist to the diameter of a napkin, and then immediately turn the page to order a 5-pound tin of invigorating beef suite. The 1903 must-haves. Description: 1903 price. The Heidelberg electric belt. Guaranteed to cure nervous debility via mild electrocution of the midsection. $18. Kenwood bicycles. A horseless carriage for the legs, minus the Wright brothers' wings. $10.95. Sears special revolver for the gentleman who wishes to defend his property or settle a debate. $2.50. Princess Bust Developer, a mechanical device that promised, well, exactly what it sounds like. $1.45. The Acme Royal Stove, a 1,500-pound cast-iron beast that could cook a feast and heat a mansion. $23.45. The Kit House Revolution. But the most audacious offering in the 1903 era, peaking just a few years later, was the Sears Modern Home. You didn't just order a window or a door, you ordered the entire house. For a few $100s, Sears would ship you a railroad car filled with 30,000 individual parts, a set of blueprints that made sense even to a man who had never held a hammer, and enough pre-cut lumber to build a two-story Victorian masterpiece. It was the ultimate do-it-yourself project, provided you had 4 months of free time and neighbors who didn't mind helping you move several tons of Georgia pine for the price of a few beers. The disruption of the country store. Richard Sears was not a popular man among the small-town merchants of 1903. To the local general store owner, the Sears catalog was a weapon of mass displacement. It allowed the customer to bypass the middleman, the local markup, and Silas's limited selection of mule-flattened hats. The backlash was spectacular. In several Midwestern towns, local merchants organized catalog fires. They would offer a free movie ticket or a bag of candy to any child who brought in their family's Sears catalog to be tossed onto a bonfire in the town square. It was a desperate, smoke-filled attempt to stop the march of progress. But Sears was a genius of psychological warfare. He responded by telling his customers to hide their catalogs in plain brown wrappers. He turned mail order into a secret society. He also instituted a send no money policy for certain items, trusting the honesty of the American farmer, a move that earned him a level of loyalty that no local merchant could ever hope to match. The rural free delivery, the government as a delivery boy. In a stroke of luck that Richard Sears couldn't have planned better himself, the U.S. government spent the years leading up to 1903 expanding rural free delivery, RFD. Before RFD, farmers had to ride into town to get their mail. With RFD, the mail came to them. This was essentially a government subsidy for Sears, Roebuck and Company. The U.S. Post Office became Richard Sears' personal distribution network. Suddenly, every farmhouse in the Republic was connected to the warehouses of Chicago. It was the Internet of 1903, but instead of fiber optic cables, it ran on mud horses and the weary legs of a mail carrier who was probably wondering why he was delivering so many 1,500-pound stoves to people who lived on top of mountains. The legendary outhouse epilogue. We cannot discuss the Sears catalog without acknowledging its legendary afterlife. In 1903, paper was a precious commodity. Once the new catalog arrived, the old one was not thrown away. It was demoted. It moved from the parlor table to the kitchen, then to the workshop, and finally, inevitably, to the outhouse. The Sears catalog was the most versatile piece of literature in American history. It provided entertainment during the long winter nights, a shopping list for the spring, and a very practical, if somewhat ink-heavy service in the final room of the house. It was said that the catalog was the only book in America that was read twice, once for the wants and once for the needs. It was only later, when Sears switched to glossy paper, that the company received thousands of angry letters from farmers claiming the catalog was no longer fit for purpose. The verdict of the wish book. As 1903 drew to a close, the Sears catalog had successfully transformed the American identity. We were no longer just a collection of isolated pioneers. We were a nation of consumers. We were united by a common desire for a Heidelberg electric belt and a Princess Bust developer. Richard Sears had proven that the world is much smaller when you can fit it inside a book. He had bypassed the geography of the country and replaced it with the geography of the warehouse. He had given every American the right to own a silk dress, a kit house, and a tombstone, all delivered with the same mechanical efficiency. The Wish Book was the heartbeat of 1903. It was the silent partner to the Wright Flyer and the Panama Canal. It proved that the 20th century wouldn't just be won by those who could fly or those who could dig, but by those who could deliver a 30-pound box of invigorating beef suite to a man in a sod house for $3.50. Chapter 16. The Iroquois Theater Fire, or the dangerous definition of fireproof. If the first 15 chapters of 1903 have taught us anything, it is that the human race possesses a truly magnificent capacity for self-delusion. We have spent the year slapping labels on things with the reckless abandon of a toddler with a sticker book. We have called a 12-second hop flight a bicycle with a motor, a silent gray fellow, and a used car trip across the desert a pleasure jaunt. But there is one word in the English language that acts as a direct challenge to the Almighty, a linguistic dare that the universe simply cannot resist. That word is fireproof. In the lexicon of early 20th century marketing, fireproof didn't actually mean will not burn. It meant probably won't burn as quickly as a hayloft in a lightning storm, provided no one lights a match. It was a comfort word, a sedative for the nerves of a public that lived in cities made primarily of wood and optimism. And in Chicago, a city that had already been burned to a crisp in 1871 and should have known better, fireproof was the gilded lie that led to the velvet-lined trap of the Iroquois Theater. The Taj Mahal of the Loop. The Iroquois Theater opened in November 1903, and it was, by all accounts, a marvel of the Gilded Age. It was a palace of marble, mahogany, and French velvet. It had 60-foot ceilings, gilded statues, and enough plush carpeting to muffle the sound of a small war. The owners, a group of gentlemen who clearly viewed over the top as a starting position, bragged that it was the most beautiful theater in America. But more importantly, they bragged about its safety. The program for the theater actually printed the words, "Absolutely fireproof." The fire inspector, a man whose professional diligence apparently consisted of squinting at a velvet curtain and deciding it looked sturdy, declared the building beyond description. He was right, though perhaps not in the way he intended. The building had no fire alarm. It had no sprinkler system, which were considered unsightly and expensive. It had no fire hose. Its primary defense against a conflagration consisted of 6 tubes of a dry powder called killfire, which was essentially baking soda in a fancy tin. Using killfire to stop a theater fire was like trying to stop a charging rhinoceros by throwing a teaspoon of salt at it. It was a charming gesture, but fundamentally misunderstood the physics of the situation. The Matinee of Errors, December 30th, 1903. On the afternoon of December 30th, the theater was packed with over 2,100 people. It was a holiday matinee of a musical called Mr. Bluebeard, starring the famous comedian Eddie Foy. The audience was composed almost entirely of women and children out for a Christmas treat. Because the show was a sellout, the management had allowed people to sit in the aisles. Furthermore, to prevent the gallery gods, the folks in the cheap seats, from sneaking down into the more expensive lower levels, they had locked the iron gates in the stairwells. They had effectively turned a luxury theater into a three-story cage lined with combustible fabric and illuminated by high-voltage electric sparks. The spark that ignited the lie. During the second act, an arc light, one of those sputtering, crackling precursors to the modern spotlight, threw a spark onto a muslin curtain. Now, in a sane world, a stagehand would have grabbed a fire extinguisher. In the world of 1903, the stagehand grabbed a tube of kill fire and began shaking it at the ceiling like he was seasoning a giant salad. The fire, unimpressed by the baking soda, climbed the curtain and spread into the flies. The area above the stage, where thousands of square yards of painted scenery, all of it soaked in oil and turpentine, were hanging like laundry in a kiln. The curtain that couldn't. Eddie Foy, a man of remarkable courage, walked out onto the stage as the scenery began to rain fire upon the dancers. He told the orchestra to keep playing and urged the audience to remain calm. He signaled for the asbestos curtain to be lowered. This was the theater's grand slam of safety features. It was a massive sheet of fire-resistant material meant to drop and seal the stage off from the audience, turning the fire into a private show behind a wall of safety. But the asbestos curtain of the Iroquois was a final tragic fraud. First, it wasn't pure asbestos. It was a mixture of wood pulp and scrap fiber. Second, as it began to descend, it snagged on a light fixture and stopped halfway down. It hung there, a useless rag, creating a flue effect that sucked fresh air in from the backstage doors and blasted a literal blowtorch of flame out into the faces of the people in the front rows. The exit strategy of a nightmare. The panic that followed was a master class in why we now have fire marshals and why they are generally very grumpy people. The Iroquois had 30 exits, which sounds generous. However, most of them were hidden behind heavy velvet drapes. Some were locked, but the most ingenious design flaw was the inward swinging door. In 1903, many public doors opened inward. This meant that when a crowd of 500 panicked people rushed toward an exit, the weight of the crowd pressed the door shut. The harder they pushed, the more impossible it became to open. It was a mechanical paradox that turned every hallway into a dead end. On the fire escapes, the situation was even worse. The builders had forgotten to install the finished stairways for the upper levels. People climbed out onto the landings only to find a 50-foot drop to the alleyway below. In the desperation of the moment, a human bridge was formed as people leaped from the fire escape of the Iroquois to the windows of the building across the alley, a feat of terrifying bravery that saved dozens, but highlighted the criminal negligence of the theater's design. The verdict of the soot. Within 30 minutes, it was over. 602 people had perished. It remains the deadliest single-building fire in American history. The aftermath was a whirlwind of finger-pointing lawsuits and the sudden, frantic realization that fireproof was a lie that killed. Every theater in Chicago was closed for weeks. The mayor was nearly lynched. The fire inspector was indicted, though in the grand tradition of Chicago politics, no one actually went to prison. But from the ashes of the Iroquois, a new world was born. The tragedy forced a global rewrite of building codes. Because of the 602 who died in Chicago, the panic bar was invented, that horizontal metal bar on exit doors that allows them to open with a simple push from the inside. outward swinging doors became mandatory in public buildings. Fire curtains were actually made of metal. Fireproof was legally redefined to fire-resistant, and salesmen were told to stop making promises that only God could keep. The moral of the smoldering mahogany. The Iroquois theater fire was the moment the 20th century's optimism hit a brick wall. It was a grim reminder that our shiny new palaces of progress were often just old-fashioned traps with better upholstery. We had learned to fly, and we had learned to build canals, but we hadn't yet learned how to let 2,000 people out of a room in a hurry. It was a tragedy born of arrogance, the belief that marble and gold could protect us from the ancient, hungry physics of a spark. 1903 ended with a heavy heart in Chicago, a city that learned far too late that the most important part of a theater isn't the stage, the velvet, or the comedy. It's the door that opens when you need it to. As we leave the charred ruins of the Iroquois, we must move toward the Old World. Because while America was struggling with its definitions of safety, others were struggling with the definition of neighbor. Chapter 17, The Kishinev Pogrom, or the Old World's favorite pastime. If the first 16 chapters of 1903 have demonstrated anything, it is that the United States was a country suffering from a severe case of newness. We were obsessed with the latest gadgets, the fastest cars, and the most efficient way to turn a swamp into a canal. We were looking forward with such intensity that we occasionally walked into walls. But as we turned our gaze across the Atlantic, we were reminded that the Old World had a very different set of priorities. While we were busy inventing the future, the Russian Empire was busy perfecting the past, specifically a past rooted in the ancient cobwebbed machinery of tribal hatred. In April 1903, in the city of Kishinev, now Chisinau, Moldova, the world was given a grim reminder that civilization is often just a very thin coat of paint on a very old, very termite-ridden fence. While the Wright brothers were measuring wind speeds, the residents of Bessarabia were measuring the depth of their own prejudices. The result was a 3-day eruption of violence that proved that while you can update a man's telegraph, you cannot always update his soul. The anatomy of an ancient lie, the blood libel. To understand Kishinev, one must first understand the blood libel. In the grand catalogue of human stupidity, the blood libel holds a place of honor, somewhere between the belief that the earth is flat and the idea that wearing a copper bracelet will cure your gout. The myth, which dates back to the Middle Ages, suggests that Jewish people require the blood of Christian children to bake their Passover matzah. Now, anyone who has actually tasted matzah knows that it is essentially a piece of salted cardboard that possesses the culinary charm of a dry shingle. The idea that it requires a secret, macabre ingredient to achieve that specific level of blandness is a feat of imaginative gymnastics that would baffle a professional acrobat. In early 1903, a Christian boy was found dead in a town near Kishinev. The local newspaper, Bessarabets, run by a man named Pavlachi Khrushchevan, a fellow whose primary contribution to literature was his ability to turn ink into bile, immediately informed the public that the boy had been murdered as part of a Jewish ritual. The fact that the boy's own uncle later confessed to the murder was, in the eyes of the local press, a minor detail that shouldn't be allowed to ruin a perfectly good riot. 3 days of orderly chaos. The violence began on Easter Sunday. In a display of religious irony that would make a gargoyle weep, the mobs moved from the churches to the Jewish quarter. For 3 days, the city of Kishinev was transformed into a laboratory of cruelty. What makes Kishinev particularly chilling in the annals of 1903 was the passive participation of the authorities. The Russian police and military stood on the street corners, presumably admiring the weather or checking their pocket watches, while the mobs went about their business. They had orders not to intervene. It was a spontaneous uprising that had been organized with the bureaucratic precision of a local zoning board meeting. When the dust finally settled, 49 people were dead, 500 were injured, and 700 homes had been reduced to splinters. The old world had spoken, and its message was that in the Russian Empire, the life of a Jewish citizen was worth significantly less than the price of the kerosene used to burn their shop. The telegraph and the global conscience. In the previous century, a pogrom in a remote corner of Bessarabia would have been a local tragedy, a whisper in the wind that reached the West months later as a footnote in a traveler's diary. But 1903 was the year of the wire. Thanks to the undersea cables and the relentless hunger of the American press, the horrors of Kishinev were beamed into the parlors of New York and London within days. The New York Times published harrowing accounts that bypassed the censors of St. Petersburg. For the first time, the Gilded Age public was forced to confront a massacre in real time. The reaction was a global roar of indignation. In the United States, mass meetings were held in every major city. This wasn't just a Jewish issue. It was a human one. It was the first time that an international humanitarian crisis was driven by the sheer speed of the news. We had discovered that the same technology that allowed us to check the price of pork in Chicago allowed us to witness the death of a family in Russia. Teddy's big stick versus the Tsar's silence. Theodore Roosevelt, a man who never met a conflict he didn't want to mediate, found himself in a delicate diplomatic dance. The American public demanded action. They wanted the big stick to swing all the way to St. Petersburg. Roosevelt, ever the strategist, organized a massive petition signed by thousands of prominent Americans, including cardinals, bishops, and captains of industry. He attempted to send it to Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar of Russia is a man who believes that if he ignores a problem long enough, it will eventually go away or be replaced by a different, more interesting problem. Mark Twain, observing the Russian court. The Tsar, in a display of regal petulance, refused to even receive the petition. He claimed it was an interference in internal affairs. It was a classic mind-your-own-business response from a man whose business was currently on fire. While the Tsar's refusal was a diplomatic dead end, it solidified the United States as the moral arbiter of the new century. We had learned that our influence wasn't just measured in canals and airplanes, but in our ability to be loud on behalf of the quiet. The Great Exodus, 1903 as a catalyst. The most lasting impact of Kishinev was not the diplomatic chatter, but the mass migration. For the Jewish population of the Russian Empire, 1903 was the year the wait-and-see policy died. They realized that the old world was a house with no exits and a very leaky roof. In the wake of the pogrom, the trickle of Jewish immigration to the United States became a flood. They arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but their stories and a desperate hope that the New World was as fireproof as it claimed to be. These immigrants would go on to shape the culture, the comedy, and the character of America. Kishinev also gave birth to a new sense of Jewish self-defense. A young man named Vladimir Jabotinsky began organizing defense units, and the Zionist movement gained a renewed, frantic urgency. The lesson of 1903 was clear. If the world wouldn't protect you, you had to find a way to protect yourself, or find a country that would. The verdict of the human race. As we look back at the Kishinev pogrom from the vantage point of 1903, it serves as the necessary shadow to our bright mechanical portraits. It reminds us that progress is a lopsided affair. We can master the air, we can master the atom, and we can master the assembly line, but we still haven't mastered the art of not killing our neighbors over a story about a cracker. It was a somber, bloody chapter in a year otherwise defined by flight and fizz. It taught us that the 20th century was going to be a struggle between the future, represented by the airplane, and the friction, represented by the pogrom. We were moving forward at 100 miles an hour, but we were still dragging the anchor of our ancient cruelties behind us. The Tsar stayed in his palace, the immigrants stayed in their tenements, and the world stayed on its axis. But something had changed. The old world was losing its grip, and the new world was learning that with great power comes the annoying responsibility of having to care about people you've never met. Chapter 18, Pelican Island and the Feather Fight, or the day Teddy Roosevelt told the milliners to flock off. If 1903 was the year we spent trying to conquer the sky with gasoline and bicycle chains, it was also the year we realized we were doing a rather thorough job of emptying the sky of the creatures who had been using it quite successfully for several million years without any help from Ohio. We must speak of the plume trade, a dark chapter in the history of American fashion that proved humanity is the only species capable of killing a bird to make itself look more like a bird. In the early years of the 20th century, the height of feminine elegance was not measured in grace or wit, but in the sheer volume of dead poultry one could balance on one's head. If a woman of high society didn't walk into a room looking like she had recently survived a collision with a migrating flock of egrets, she was considered practically invisible. The architecture of the avian graveyard. To understand the feather fight, you must first appreciate the Victorian and Edwardian hat. These were not merely garments, they were architectural marvels of taxidermy. A fashionable hat in 1903 might feature a spray of egret plumes, known as aigrettes, a few wings from a tern, or, if the lady was feeling particularly adventurous, the entire stuffed carcass of a hummingbird. The demand for these feathers was so ravenous that it sparked a gold rush-style frenzy in the Florida Everglades. The plume hunters were men who possessed the moral compass of a shark and the aim of a sharpshooter. They would move into the nesting rookeries during the height of the breeding season, when the bird's plumage was at its most vibrant, and systematically slaughter every adult bird in sight. They would strip the skins and leave the orphan chicks to starve. Also, a socialite in New York could have a bit of flair for her Sunday stroll. By 1903, the snowy egret was on the brink of extinction, and the brown pelican was rapidly becoming a rumor. The sky was being traded for the vanity of the parlor, and it seemed that nothing short of a miracle or a very loud president could stop it. The bird watcher in the White House. Enter Theodore Roosevelt. Now, we have already established that T.R. was a man of action, a man of the big stick, and a man who viewed a quiet afternoon as a personal failure. But beneath the khaki and the bully bluster beat the heart of a man who could identify a warbler by the way it blinked. T.R. was a naturalist of the first order. He didn't just want to hunt the wilderness. He wanted to ensure there was enough of it left for him to hunt in later. In early 1903, Roosevelt was alerted to the slaughter taking place on Pelican Island, a tiny 5-acre mangrove island on Florida's Indian River. The island was the last great nesting ground for the brown pelican, and the plume hunters were closing in. Roosevelt consulted his lawyers in the Department of Agriculture. He asked if there was any precedent for the federal government to seize a piece of land specifically to protect a bird that didn't have the decency to be an official national symbol like the eagle. The lawyers, being lawyers, hummed and hawed. They pointed out that there was no specific law allowing the president to create a wildlife refuge by executive fiat. They suggested a committee. They suggested a study. They suggested waiting until the next congressional session. I so declare it, the executive peak. Roosevelt, as we have seen with the Panama Canal, was not a man who enjoyed waiting for the proper channels. He viewed the proper channels as something you used when you didn't have a large enough pen to write your own orders. On March 14, 1903, T.R. reportedly turned to his advisers and asked a very simple, very dangerous question. Is there any law that will prevent me from declaring Pelican Island a federal bird reservation? The advisers admitted that while there was no law allowing it, there wasn't exactly a law forbidding it, mostly because no one had ever imagined a president would bother himself with the real estate of a pelican. Roosevelt didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pen and uttered the 4 words that changed the American landscape forever. Very well, then, I so declare it. With that single, arrogant, magnificent stroke of a pen, Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge was born. It was the first of its kind. T.R. didn't ask Congress. He didn't consult the state of Florida. He didn't even ask the pelicans. He simply decided that the federal government was now in the business of protecting things that couldn't vote. The birth of the warden and the war of the woods. Declaring an island a refuge is one thing. Keeping a man with a shotgun off it is another. To protect his new kingdom, T.R. appointed Paul Krugel as the first National Wildlife Refuge Warden. Krugel was a German immigrant with a magnificent beard and a very long boat. His salary was exactly $1 a month, which the Audubon Society had to pay because Congress refused to fund Roosevelt's bird hobby. Krugel's job was to sit on the edge of Pelican Island with a rifle and a scowl, informing the plume hunters that the birds were now federal property. It was a dangerous gig. Plume hunters were not known for their respect for federal authority or their love of beards. In the years that followed, several wardens would be murdered in the line of duty. But the line had been drawn in the Florida mud. The feather fight had moved from a matter of fashion to a matter of law. The audit of the bonnet, 1903's legacy. The creation of Pelican Island in 1903 was the start of a conservation landslide. By the time T.R. left office, He had created 51 national wildlife refuges, 5 national parks, and 150 national forests. He protected 230 million